Written below is the last known statement of Benjamin Harper, a former American parish priest serving the village of Barton, Cheshire. Mr. Martin was relieved of his position by Bishop Gerald Ellison of the Cheshire Diocese and taken here to Byron House, a home for the mentally disturbed, shortly after suffering an acute episode of hysterical anxiety. There, he came under the direct care of one Dr. George Monroe, the head psychiatrist. Mr. Barton's growing insanity is believed to have been triggered by his inability to accept the loss of his close friend and predecessor, Stephen Adams. Following the death of his mentor, Mr. Harper suffered a rapid decline in both his sanity and his faith that ultimately led to his confinement. Mr. Harper's stay in Byron House, however brief, as he vanished from his cell not long after this statement was recorded. Through unknown means, he is thought to have overcome the security staff, brutally murdering one of the junior physicians, Dr. Howard Fleming, before making good his escape. The weeks prior to his flight marked some of the most dramatic alterations in his demeanor. The house staff would often report that Mr. Harper's mood would shift dramatically and without provocation, particularly during the nighttime hours. Some of the orderlies even refused to work with him, citing a disturbing smirk that would creep across his face, most often as a precursor to his fluctuating moods. In the months that passed since his disappearance, I have been able to directly confirm several of the less outlandish claims made in his statement. Some of the events described within, however, are simply too fantastical for me to officially stake my reputation on acknowledging. Others are woefully and worryingly repugnant in their authenticity. There is little doubt that Barton is a strange place. Stranger still is the unsettling grip that it has upon some of the village's residents. There is a tangible miasma of superstition and fear that lurks over the village like a blanket of fog. Outsiders may very well scoff at those who put stock in old tales of witches and werewolves, but to many residents of the village, there is little distinction between reality and folklore. I cannot deny that I, despite being a man of science, find the strange history of Barton seductive and even nourishing, as it is for all those who harbor a secret and inescapable appetite for the weird. We need only walk down certain decaying streets in the south end of the village and take note of the odd symbols and signs that the common folk keep over their doors to see that a great many in Barton refuse to let the old ways die. During my time at Byron House, I too have seen things that I cannot fully comprehend or provide reason for. I have treated many long-time Barton residents who firmly believe, with a level of conviction not seen in many conventional religions, that the devil makes his grotto in the shadowed woods that crown the edges of the village. I have decided to share Mr. Harper's account of his growing madness in his own words, in the hopes that many in the scientific community will be able to gain an insight into how and why such episodes of insanity come to fruition and how they can be successfully treated. It is also my hope that if any of the stranger occurrences written below ring true to you, the reader, then this statement will also serve as a dire warning and a lesson in meddling with the affairs of certain circles, who clearly do not take kindly to outside interferences. These, then, are the last known words of Benjamin Harper. I don't understand. What more do you want me to say? I've told my story to the police, to the doctors here, and anyone else who will listen. You have no right to keep me locked up in this place. I have committed no crime and caused no harm to anyone. I would still have my freedom and the village's safety had it not been for a lone passerby spotting me in the darkness of the cemetery on that awful night and alerting the police. This whole affair would have been covered up and done with, and you would have remained blissfully ignorant to my involvement in the matter had those blundering idiots not interfered. You say I'm mad. You may well be right, but if you had come to the same conclusion as I did regarding the fate of my poor friend, I am sure you too would have taken some form of desperate action. No doubt the police report will detail the simple facts of the matter. Without bothering to add the nuances that hold the whole affair together, I am confident that the report will dryly state that in the early morning of December 5th, I, Benjamin Harper, was found in the darkest corner of Barton Parish Cemetery. I was discovered, the police report will say, disturbing a suspected burial site, digging up the cold winter earth below an ancient and twisted wych elm tree, beneath which once lay the remains of a wicked and vile occupant. It will also state that, in a fit of unrestrainable rage, I attacked 2 police officers with a shovel, rendering them unconscious so that my grim labor could be completed without interruption. It is not my sanity that I fear for now, rather the possession of my feeble mind in the body it is currently master over. For I am now horribly aware that the mind, soul, and body are not as tightly intertwined as the so-called experts of medical and spiritual matters believe them to be, but are instead 3 separate spheres of mastery. I can only hope that the truth of my tale is fully appreciated before an all too familiar terror is forced upon my mind. For I now wonder if wickedness and insanity are truly mental conditions or some form of spiritual sickness. Can either be inherited, carried in the blood, and passed on to our descendants? Can they be transfused from parents to their children? If so, what other darkness can be inherited, carried along the roots of our family history? It is possible that sin itself can plunge endlessly in the crimson rapids of our ancestors' veins, biding its time, waiting patiently for the chance to emerge within the next generation. I confess to you that I am uncertain as to the authenticity of what I am about to tell you. The terrible truth is that ever since I came to Byron House, I cannot recall if what happened was but a dream. Even now, I cannot say with any certainty that I am awake or simply dreaming that I am awake. The boundary between reality and hallucination is a frail shroud indeed. And who can say from which side of that curtain any of us are truly peeking? Hark, gentlemen, hearken unto me. I beseech you to take heed of my words. There is something wicked out there in the backwoods and borders of our village. Though its earthly fetters have been laid to waste, the potency of its spirit lingers. In time, it will find a new home and set its powers against us. For the sake of my soul, as well as the soul of my dear friend, I will now try to recount for you in detail that blasphemous chain of events that led me to the grave of Francis Ellis Pendle, the occupant of that hidden burial chamber, and immerse his body in acid until nothing but bubbling black sludge remains. Stephen Adams had been a family friend for as long as I could remember. A devout man of God, he had been the local vicar since I was a young boy and was very much loved by the community he served. He never married or had much in the way of a family of his own, and as such, I think he always looked at me and my mother as his own flesh and blood. In the twilight of my teenage years, my father sadly passed away from a heart attack, and my relationship with Stephen grew stronger, forming a bond that nurtured me into manhood and shaped me into the person I am today. For this, I owe Stephen a debt of gratitude, one I hope I came close to repaying when I finally destroyed the horror that had infected itself upon his life on that lonely December night. Stephen was a true paragon, godly, honorable, and wise. He was devoid of vice and all of the other flaws inherent in most of us. I never once saw him grow angry, fearful, or dispassionate at any point, save towards the very end. Despite his almost saintly behavior, the man was also incredibly human and very much interested in matters of science as well as faith. He had on occasion said that Darwin's theories made a lot of sense and that he enjoyed reading books covering topics such as biology as well as chemistry, physics, and history. He was a remarkably well-rounded and well-adjusted man. Not once did his belief in God falter. He was just about able to see the sense of how the world worked and blended it into his love of his fellow man and the Almighty. When I came of age, I decided to follow in his footsteps and join the church myself. I can't say my mother was particularly pleased with my choice, but Stephen was very proud of me, and it was this approval that fueled my desire to serve my God and community just as he did. My mother had been warned with Stephen, despite how closely he associated with us both. I suspected that they had once harbored feelings for each other, and that these had turned sour around the time of my birth. My father had never allowed this matter to interfere with their own friendship, and they had been like brothers, right up until my father's last breath. It was Stephen who had been at my father's deathbed. who had spoken kind words into his ear as he gasped for breath, and who had given a moving eulogy as his casket was lowered into the ground. I don't recall my mother ever mentioning my father's death after the funeral, nor had I once seen her cry or lament his passing. She simply grew colder and more distant with the people around her, including both me and Stefan. As such, I didn't feel burdened by my decision to leave her and Barton behind. My heart wasn't heavy at the thought, but rather the opposite. Stefan assisted my decision to join the ministry, and as I spoke to several authorities from the Diocese of Chester and attended an interview with my bishop, my resolve to become ordained only grew stronger. By the time I had secured my place at the Theological College of Worcestershire, my mother had slowly come to terms with my choice, but I never received her blessing or encouragement for treading the path I was determined to embark on. Worcestershire wasn't close to Cheshire. A 5-hour train journey was required whenever I wished to visit my family home. I remained in contact with Stefan weekly via letter, and regularly a handwritten note in a telltale stiff card envelope would arrive for me in the post. Our correspondence wasn't particularly thrilling, but it was welcomed as his letters of encouragement helped to guide me through the more difficult parts of my study and fire up in me a conviction that only he could coax. Months of grueling study passed me by, and I am not too proud to admit that I occasionally regretted my choice. During these bouts of demoralization, I would call my mother, who would delight in such talk and beg me to return home. A gesture I found bemusing, considering her absent feelings for me were part of the reason that I chose to leave Barton. It was Stefan's letters, however, that held me back and kept me upon the path I had chosen for myself. On rare breaks, I would return to Barton for brief stays, and we'd chat about the various topics we had discussed in our exchange of letters. Stefan's main area of interest had changed drastically in the months I'd been gone, and he was now ferociously researching local Cheshire history, in particular our folklore and other esoteric matters, the details of which were lost on me. I would make a token effort of visiting my mother, but the blanket of cold repression that fell across the kitchen as we sat in silence over a pot of tea was becoming more and more unbearable. Once or twice, I felt as if she wanted to tell me something, but she would stop herself before anything significant left her lips, and she would instead inquire sarcastically into Stefan's well-being before reaffirming her objection towards my study. But as time passed, these sojourns to Barton ceased altogether, as I threw myself deeper and deeper into theological pursuits, relying solely upon Stefan's letters to keep me informed about how my mother was doing. It had been some weeks before I noticed a gradual change in my routine that piqued my interest in matters beyond my own affairs. So engrossed had I been in my studies that I had neglected to notice that Stefan's letters to me had abruptly stopped. I waited a week before sending him a note of my own in hopes of a response, but nothing came. I could only assume that he had become engrossed in study himself, as he had the habit of picking up a new topic and devouring as much information as he could before finding a new sphere of knowledge to move on to. To be quite honest, I was focused on my own study, and was so welcomed the break in my weekly task of finding something interesting to fill my letters with. This absence of communication lasted just under 5 weeks, when eventually one of Stefan's letters arrived for me on a Friday morning. I was already on my way out, so opened the letter and read its contents while walking to the local parish I was helping to curate at. Dodging traffic and pedestrians alike, I read the note and folded it into my pocket, determined to pen my reply as soon as time permitted. As best as my memory serves, the much-delayed letter read as follows.
Benjamin, firstly, let me apologize for my lack of communication with you over the past few weeks. I have, as you may have figured out for yourself, stumbled upon a fascinating area of Cheshire history that our own parish was directly involved in some 2 centuries ago. Now, I understand that this is hardly an excuse for neglecting you, and I sincerely apologize if my absence has caused you any worry. Please read on, and I shall attempt to explain. I've been investigating our parish's history, and in doing so, come across an obscure piece of information that points to a witch trial taking place within our community, well after the Witchcraft Act of 1735 had forbidden all forms of necromancy and sorcery from being punishable crimes. How scandalous! To think that our dear community of Barton was involved in some sordid affair well after such matters had ceased to be acknowledged by the Crown. Details are sketchy, but it seems much of the affair was conducted in secret, and many later records destroyed in order to prevent the facts surrounding it from ever resurfacing. Now, here comes the really intriguing part. The individual tried and executed for practicing witchcraft is none other than a distant relative of mine on my mother's side, one Francis Ellis Pendle. This is how I was able to unearth certain details, as they've been sat in my family's records for over a century. The whole matter has me deeply excited, and I'm currently waiting on several sources to provide me with information on various subjects, but I believe I am so close to worming out the truth. I have reason to believe that this ancestor is buried right here in the parish cemetery. Try as I might, I cannot find a grave, but from what I've read, witches were sometimes buried in unmarked plots. A curse upon their names and a final punishment for trucking with the devil. It was also a precaution, for if any of their coven could unearth the remains, they could restore them to life, or so the folklore goes. But here I am getting ahead of myself again. How have you been, my boy? I look forward to hearing about the past few weeks I've missed out on, so please furnish me with all the details. I understand you'll be finishing your first year soon, and once you have, I ask that you come to stay with me in Barton for a while, for there is much we must discuss about my findings. Take care of yourself, Benjamin.
The letter did not unnerve me in the least. It was just like him to find some new topic to obsess over, and I thought little of the matter. Stefan had always been this way. No doubt in his next letter, he would be talking just as enthusiastically about a completely different topic, with witchcraft far from his mind. I wrote a meager reply that night. Nothing terribly fancy, just a passive interest in what he had mentioned, and also a little update on how my studies were going. I responded to his invitation to join him at Barton Parish and said that it would be a pleasure to spend some time with him. After my first year was finished, I was able to come home for Christmas. To my delight, my mother invited Stefan to our home for lunch. Christmas itself is a busy time for the ordained, but I was grateful for the snatches of conversation we managed to have. To my surprise, Stefan had not dropped his inquiries into his ancestor and the various Cheshire witch trials, both legal and illegal, that had occurred in the county. In fact, he would speak of little else during my short stay with him. He was particularly excited because he believed he had finally located where Francis Ellis Pendle had been laid to rest. He described to me in great detail, over a brandy, that at the very back of the cemetery, close to where the Gunner's Clough woodland starts to encroach upon the hollowed ground, that there can be found a small copse of wych elm trees, so called because witches were once hanged from them. It was his belief that Francis had been interned in the ground beneath one of these trees, a precaution levied against him, as the old folk believed that the roots of the tree would pin the witch's body and soul in place, denying either the power to rise from the grave and avenge themselves upon the living. The next morning, he took me out to see the copse where he suspected the final resting place of his witch ancestor lay. Even in the daytime, it was a dark and blasted place. The trees looked more dead than alive, the twisting dry branches that groaned like the croaking of a floorboard as the wind lightly danced around them. Here, somewhere beneath the dark ground, Stefan was convinced that the body of Francis lay. I cannot say with conviction that even then I was worried about him. I had convinced myself that his interest was purely historical. He was nothing more than an enthusiastic amateur. In hindsight, however, the warning signs were undoubtedly present. I would come and visit Barton sporadically during my second and third year at college. I think I was subconsciously outgrowing the place, but in the best possible way. I was shaping into the man I always wanted to be, and I felt renewed by my growing independence from both Stefan and my mother. It was during the last part of my ordination, my final year, that I first heard the growing rumors regarding Stefan and his radical change in behavior. The source of such gossip came from none other than my mother. There was a certain sense of satisfaction in her tone upon informing me of the various distasteful exploits that Stefan was being accused of. He was now apparently drinking heavily and had been spotted meeting with certain unsavory types after dark. Strange visitors had been seen in the cemetery, always at night. He was, she said, keeping company with odd strangers who spoke in foreign tongues and who wore bizarre clothing. Loud, violent behavior in the middle of the night was becoming a regular occurrence for his neighborhood, as voices were heard emanating from the church house at all hours. There was even talk that several pets had gone missing in the village. In particular, Mrs. Zebowitz's tabby cat, Chloe, and Old Man Slatter's greyhound, Basil. The latter was known to roam freely around the village and was almost always in constant trouble, tipping over trash cans and chasing Jack Dunkel's chickens. Some people assumed that the dog had either run off or been hit by a car, but a fair number attributed a more ominous reason behind the dog's sudden vanishing. The cat, however, was rarely seen outside of Zebowitz's home. Many assumed that the eldest son, Ian, was the culprit. The boy always had a cruel streak and was disliked by almost everyone in the village, including his own mother. But when the decayed, headless body of a cat and the severed head of a greyhound were found casually discarded in the gunner's cloth by some local children the day after Walpurgis, many began to suspect that Stefan's sinister new acquaintances were responsible. The most disturbing revelation, however, was that Stefan's face appeared to have taken on a rather unusual countenance. A kind of sardonic smirk that greatly unnerved those who saw it. By all rights, the expression was wholly alien to the man, and when seen, it appeared to twist his face to such an extent that he looked like a stranger. The bishop of the Chester diocese had issued him a formal warning about his behavior, the outcome of which I would soon learn of. At the time, I found all this impossible to believe. The evils being attributed to my friend were nothing more than the village gossip, I believe, and the usual Barton superstitions. Something for the old codgers to grumble over whilst deep in their cups, and I refused to accept the rumors or take the matter seriously. Soon enough, however, I too became embroiled in the abnormal changes in Stefan's life. Again, there was a period of time where I didn't receive regular correspondence from Stefan. In fact, these periods had grown more frequent. But I admit that I was beginning to grow worried. As the rumors regarding his behavior churned in my mind and the large gulf between his letters was growing even wider as time passed, I hadn't received a letter back from him for a very long time, perhaps 4 months. But when I finally did, it was far more disturbing than anything I had ever read from him, and it filled me with an urgent need to see my friend and assist him however I could. It arrived for me unexpectedly, much like the previous one I had described. And despite looking like a letter from Stefan, it was so hastily scrawled that for a few seconds, I thought it was just written by a stranger.
Benjamin, I am afraid to tell you this, but I fear I have led myself down a dark and winding path. So far have I descended into darkness, and so deeply have I gazed at the blackness that I wonder if I will ever be able to find my way back to the Lord's light. My meddling in the past affairs of the parish and my own family history have brought me nothing but misery. I'm doomed. It's the dreams, Ben. The hideous dreams. I dream constantly, so much so that I can no longer tell what is real and what is fantasy. I dream often of a cold, godless place, devoid of warmth and comfort. Above me, I see twisting black roots worming their way slowly towards me like serpents. Try as I might, I cannot move my arms and legs, for my body is confined to a casket, a buried, rotting, maggot-infested casket. When I finally awake, the clock by my bedside always displays the same time. 3 a.m., the witching hour. By the time you read this, I may not be at the parish. I must leave this place, leave Barton and never return. I have some dire matters to attend to. Most importantly, I must return that which I have called. He has his own black designs, and I must ensure that they never come to fruition. In my more lucid moments, I'm formulating a plan, but I must be prudent, lest he suspects me of acting. I must be decisive and deliberate in my actions and conceal all evidence from him before the sun sets and his time begins. He has his means, that is beyond doubt, but I also have mine. I know of certain antique formulas and signs that can ward off his spirit, potent as it may be. Once I am sure that this evil is returned to the cold ground, his remains must be destroyed. Fire is no good. It will leave too much intact. It must be something stronger, something that will obliterate him until there is nothing left. I will then take my leave. I have already spoken with the bishop, and we both agree that you are ready to take my place, Ben. May you be a better guide to the people of this parish than I. Ben, if I fail in my endeavors, I can offer you only this warning. Fear that which lurks beneath the witch tree. Do not invite it in, for it will make itself a home within you and through you work its black magic. It will invoke those who lurk at the threshold, those unnameable blasphemies from the great outside. And then, my friend, we are all ruined. God bless you.
To say this letter disturbed me greatly would be a gross understatement. I had never known my friend to be so worried or panicked over anything in his life, and yet here he was, telling me that his very soul was in jeopardy. I spoke with my superiors at the college, but I did not show them the note Stefan had sent me. I feared that should anyone else read the note, they would question his sanity, and that might put in motion a whole course of events regrettable to the man's already frayed reputation. No, best I speak to him first and get to the root of the issue. A few days later, I was on a train, and bound home for Barton. I disembarked at the nearby Eastwich station and caught a rickety old bus into the village, arriving around midday, and hastily made my way in the direction of the parish church. Several locals recognized me, and I had to pause momentarily for a few quick exchanges before resuming my journey. I did my best not to look panicked and to keep my gait to an acceptable stride as I gave each passerby my time, but deep inside, I was overcome with a crippling dread that only increased as I neared my destination. When at last I arrived at the church gates, I found them closed but not barred. Pushing their heavy iron frames inwards, I walked past the small stone fountain, which was bone dry and not flowing with the gentle trickling sound that usually welcomes visitors. The surrounding benches that crowded the fountain were empty, as was the entire churchyard and cemetery. I couldn't help but notice the serene yet disturbing quiet of the place as I headed straight for the church doors, which were worryingly locked. I looked around, puzzled. Stefan should have been inside and getting ready for the evening service. I picked up my bags and made my way around the church and towards the small residence at the back where Stefan lived. The front doors, like that of the church, was locked. The curtains were open, and I peeked inside but could see no sign of life. I then did a quick detour of the perimeter, knocking and calling on every door and window before returning to the front. I assured myself that there must be a perfectly mundane excuse for him not being present at the church, and mused that maybe he was out picking up provisions from Litter's store on Townfield Lane. The relief of such a normal explanation was abruptly shattered, however, by the gruff and familiar voice of a man barking out to me from the direction of the cemetery.
Vicar's gone, Ben. I don't suppose he's coming back any time soon.
I cocked my head in the direction of the voice and called out, my words feebly battling against the gusts of winds that were coalescing piles of brown autumn leaves, causing them to dance around the dry gray fountain behind me. "Is that you, Ted?" I called, already knowing the answer to my question. To my reply, the tall and wiry frame of old Ted Quilt slowly emerged from behind a large headstone. He had a small shovel in one hand and was no doubt tending to the earth around the cemetery, just as he had for as long as I could recall. Despite the autumn chill, he wiped sweat from his brow and waved at me before picking up his tools. As he made his way towards me, his long white hair and beard billowing in the wind, I could not banish thoughts of the old pagan gods from my mind. With his towering height and wizened but friendly old face, he reminded me of Woden, the chieftain of gods and leader of the dreaded wild hunt from the old Saxon legends.
Sorry, Ben. Didn't scare you, did I? I heard you come in. Well, I heard the gate clang. Figured I'd let you look around before speaking up.
No, it's quite all right, Ted, I replied. What did you mean just now? That Stefan was gone and wouldn't be coming back?
Oh, it's best you come inside, boy. The vicar left me some instructions for you and the keys to his house. Come on, I'll make us some tea.
He rested one of his giant hands on my shoulder.
I won't lie to you, Ben. I've got some queer things to tell you.
With that, he pulled the front door key from the back of his tattered trousers and unlocked the front door of Stefan's house, causing the lock to make a heavy clunking sound as the door opened ajar. He entered, and I followed behind. still confused as to what I could have missed in the time since I had heard from Stefan. Ted immediately headed for the kitchen, where, true to his words, he put on a pot of tea and sat down to roll himself a cigarette whilst waiting for the tea to brew.
Hungry?
He turned to ask me, scraping his tongue across the cigarette's paper skin and gesturing to some biscuits on a nearby plate. Later, perhaps, I replied with a weak smile. The smell of the brewing tea filled the room and offered me a little comfort. Stefan had always appreciated a strong tea. I placed my bags down and looked around the room. It was exactly how I'd remembered it, untouched and impeccably clean, as was Stefan's fancy. Ted looked quite out of place in such an uncluttered arena. With his wild beard and dirt-stained clothing, he didn't say anything to me, engrossed as he was in his cigarette rolling, which caused me to grow a little impatient with the man. Look, if something happened to Stefan, you have to let me know quickly, Ted. What is it? He proceeded to pour 2 cups of tea, and after passing one along with a small jug of milk, he struck a match and lit his cigarette before leaning back in his chair and sighing.
There isn't an easy way to say this, Ben, so I'll just come out with it. Stephen's left the parish. His ways, shall we say, over the last few months have been unnerving many of the parishioners, and the bishop felt it was in everyone's best interest that he takes his leave, at least for a few months.
I nodded, not so much in agreement, but simply out of shock. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the last 2 letters Stefan had sent me and handed them over to Ted, who placed his cup on the table and took them into his hands without saying a word. He stroked his snow-white beard whilst intermittently nodding and sighing as he flitted from page to page, occasionally pre-reading a section and then nodding once more. Once finished, he handed them back to me, picked up his cup and took a sip, straining the brown liquid through his beard. Do these letters mean anything to you?
A little. He was talking about that bloody witchcraft business an awful lot. I knew some of what he was talking about, especially those trees out back past the graveyard. I used to play around the Gunner's Clough as a boy, and they would always tell about how evil that place was. You're from Barton, you must have heard the old tales about ghosts and goblins, and how old Saltpeter would get you if you lingered too long past sundown.
Recalling the childhood memory of how my grandfather would warn me of entering the Gunner's Clough after dark. You stay away from those woods, boy, he would say. Saltpeter, Salty Pete, some call him. On 3 legs he goes. He'll trick you into the woods using the voice of someone you know. That's just an old wives' tale, Ted, I finally replied. Stefan would never have taken such talk seriously. Imps and witches, familiars, it's just childish superstition.
Well, I can't argue with you there, Ben,
he said, taking another sip of his tea.
But it was more the weird changes in his nature that I wanted to talk to you about, not all this witchy nonsense.
He tapped the letters on the table, as if to emphasize how little he thought of their contents. Such as? I said, picking up my own cup.
Well, a couple folks rumbled him good to the bishop over his nightly doings. They say he'd been calling regularly with shady types from Eastwich and that he was involved in some missing money here at the parish. Quite a sum if folk are to be believed. Then there's the strange sounds and stranger lights coming from the cemetery.
My mother was telling me about this weeks ago, I added. I didn't want to believe her. She's never been too keen on Stefan.
Not just that, Ben. It was his own manner. He just stopped giving a damn about the community. He turned into this cruel, morose man, almost a complete stranger, really. Unsettled a lot of the locals.
He took a few more sips of his tea and finished his cigarette before continuing.
So there was a village meeting, and with the agreement of the Dioceses in Chester and the bishop, it was decided that he should leave us. Can't say I know where he's gone, but I reckon they'd want you to take over his duties, if you're willing, at least until the bishop can find a replacement.
He stood up and opened a nearby drawer, producing a sealed letter. It bore the mark of Chester. Opening it, its contents confirmed what Ted was hinting at. I didn't know what to say. I was supposed to start my tenure as a curate under Stefan, not become the village vicar. Why didn't Bishop Ellison speak to me directly about this? Ted simply shrugged before continuing.
There's something else you should know, Ben. You brace yourself now, because what I have to say next is going to upset you.
I stiffened my back in response and allowed him to continue.
Some believe that Stephen may be dead. Let me finish. I said some believe he may be dead, but that doesn't make it so. Nonetheless, no one has heard hide nor hair of him since he left. Phil Crouch heard a rumour that a man who looked just like Stephen had been spotted down by the locks a few nights ago. You know, the ones on the river, down past the canal that runs through Blackcroft. He was ranting and raving, as Stephen, that is, almost as if he was having a quarrel with himself. Well, Phil says he came to see what the fuss was, and he swears hands down that he saw Stephen throw himself into the locks. He told the local bobbies about what he'd seen, but they couldn't find anything amiss. I thought you should know, lest you hear it from someone else in less favourable terms.
I felt my world come crashing down around me. This was too much for me to absorb at once. Every man, be he a saint or a sinner, has his share of faults. But to hear of these developments, coupled with the last letter Stefan had sent, and the news that he may have killed himself, not to mention the expectation that I should take his place at the parish. I need time to think about this, Ted, I said, standing up slowly. He nodded and finished his drink before standing himself.
I understand. Look, no one is expecting you to hold a service or anything. The whole village knows the situation, and I just think they and the council are glad to have you here. You won't have to perform any public services, not until you're good and ready at least. No doubt a replacement will be found for him before too long. And try not to worry too much about what Phil Crouch says. You know him. Stupefied with drink half the time. I'm sure Stephen's fine. He's probably just taking the time he needs.
He pointed to the keys on the table.
These are yours until it's all sorted out. Look, I'd best get back to work out there. If you need me, just say so, but I hope you'll stay.
Patting me on the shoulder, Ted left, leaving me sat alone in the kitchen. My mind was ablaze with confusion and doubt. Just what chaos had I returned to? It took no small amount of time for me to settle into the house. I avoided going into town at all costs and only received a minimal amount of visitors, many of which were only at my door seeking gossip. I quickly dismissed the worst of them and focused instead on the genuine well-wishers and sympathizers, of which there were depressingly few. Apart from Ted, the only person I spoke to regularly was my mother, who was less than supportive with the whole matter, and only offered a few snipes about the man I had come to think of as my father. I spent the rest of my time in the church, taking care of daily chores and wandering around the cemetery, where I could occasionally bump into Ted and have a short, pleasant, although sterile conversation about the weather before moving on. The days were growing colder, and I would frequently bring him hot tea and food as he worked relentlessly on maintaining the church grounds, especially those close to where the feral brambles of the gunner's cloth constantly encroached. He wasn't bad company by any means, but as the days turned into weeks, we found less and less to talk about. I also kept in constant contact with Bishop Ellison, who offered me all the support he could in running the parish. He was confident that a replacement for Stefan would be found quickly, but was very sensitive about discussing it in detail, knowing just how close he had been to me. It was during one of these many daily excursions around the churchyard that I decided to revisit the wych elm tree that Stefan had once shown me. I had explored most of the large open cemetery which borders the gunner's cloth. I cannot state with any clear conviction what had possessed me to walk around that lonesome and lonely stretch of graveyard, crammed as it was with the crumbling tombstones, the names of their occupants long since worn away by the passage of time. In the shade of those large forsaken trees, there rested some of the oldest and most decrepit headstones in the whole cemetery. Many of them leaned at steep angles, and some had toppled over entirely, their surfaces now home to moss and lichen. I passed each in turn, trying in vain to make out the names and dates that had been washed away by the relentless rain of northwestern England, until I came across the wych elm tree once more. Nestled at the very back of the copse, deep in the shadows of a particularly diseased-looking tree, I could see a patch of ground that appeared to have been freshly excavated. I made my way closer and stood in front of it, noticing that a small carved stone had been half submerged in the recently disturbed soil. It was green and furry with moss. I bent down and ran my hand around it, and found the clumps of moss growing upon its surface easy enough to pull off. Beneath the vegetation, I could spy that there was an inscription and date chiseled into the sandstone underneath, where the moss had preserved it. Here lies Francis Ellis Pendle, beloved by the devil, unforgotten by his disciples, 1751 AD. The carving was undoubtedly old, and despite the protection afforded to it by the moss, it was still eroded and worn away in parts. As I pulled the stone out from the earth, I noticed a newer, fresher-looking carving on the back. It was an odd shape, some kind of hieroglyph. It's difficult to truly say just what it was. It appeared somewhat familiar to a pagan pentagram, but the lines were broken, resulting in a series of independent points, in the middle of which sat what looked like a lozenge-shaped eye. In place of a pupil, there was instead a small flame-like shape. The symbol must have been heathen in origin, for I had never encountered its like in my years of religious studies. The whole stone was perhaps only 10 inches in height, hardly what one would call a tombstone, but appearing to hold the same purpose. Instinctively, I dropped the stone close to where I had found it and rubbed the dirt off my hands. I felt as if I had just come in contact with something unmistakably evil, as if my very soul had been touched by the hoary and eldritch nature of whatever darkness it had been used to commemorate. It was then that the words from the Stefan's last note crept into my mind. The hour was growing late. The dimming sun caused the darkness of Gunner's cloth to wash over me, enveloping me with its black folds. I had no desire to stay in that place, and hastily made my way back to the house, determined to reach it before the sun disappeared behind those vile trees. Once again, I breathed a sigh of relief, and then set about preparing myself a supper of some toast and fresh tea. Try as I might, I could not banish the warning from Stefan's letter. Eventually, perhaps driven by a need to see if I had remembered his words correctly, I took the bundle of Stefan's letters from the kitchen drawer, where I kept them tucked away beneath some parish leaflets, and sifted through them until I found the one that mentioned Stefan's talk of witchcraft. I unfolded it and reread it until I came to the passage with the warning. I had indeed remembered it verbatim. Unnerved, I folded up the letters and hastily placed them back in the drawer. A moment later, Ted came into the kitchen, grumbling about the cold and wiping his mud-stained boots on the doormat. He nodded and helped himself to the tea I had brewed, before sitting himself down and pulling out his tobacco to roll himself a cigarette. I waited a few minutes for him to progress halfway through his task before broaching the subject of Stefan and his strange decline. "So, Ted, did Stefan ever mention a grave to you? One out in the yard, close to the woods?" He put his tobacco down and nodded.
Aye, I saw him looking over it a bunch of times. He told me it was the grave of a witch, hung for his crimes hundreds of years ago. One of the last in England, he reckoned.
"And that was what he was studying before this change of character came over him?" He nodded again and lit his cigarette with a match before extinguishing it with the shake of his hand.
"Studied is one way of putting it. Obsession would be another. You know, he converted the cellar of this house into some kind of study. A library, I guess you could call it, filled with all sorts of queer-looking books. Latin, I reckon, not unusual for a vicar, I suppose. But some of them is written in German, and others in languages I can't begin to understand. Not only that, but he moved all kinds of bloody chemicals and equipment in there too. Can't really say I recognise most of it. Place stinks to high heaven."
"Is it still there? In the cellar?"
"No, I reckon he took almost everything with him when the bishop told him to leave. Might be some bits and pieces down there, but you'd be lucky to find much."
We both then sat in silence, Ted turning his attention to a local newspaper folded on the table, and myself to my thoughts. The next day, acting largely upon a hunch, I contacted the Eastwich College and asked to speak to their head, who turned out to be a rather jovial man called Lee Humphrey, who was all too happy to answer any and all of my questions. Over the phone, he confirmed a suspicion of mine that he and Stefan had some mild correspondence concerning lab equipment and various chemicals, compounds, and acids. He reeled off several overly long and complex names, oblivious to the fact that I was totally ignorant to what he was speaking. I thanked him and hung up the phone, a few more pieces of the puzzle slotting into place in my mind. The distance between them, however, was too great to form a larger, cohesive picture. Witchcraft and science, chemistry, and an obsession with 200-year-old hidden grave? How did they connect? Determined to uncover more, I decided to visit the library Stefan had set up and then dismantled during that time we were separated. The entrance to the cellar was in the kitchen, behind a narrow door that I first presumed had been a broom closet. It concealed a flight of cold stone steps that led to a distinctly dank and musty underground room. A few cramped shelves on the walls either side of the steps housed a collection of mundane objects, candles, dried-out paint cans, and the like, but also, luckily, a working flashlight. I took the latter and switched it on as I descended the steps. The cellar wasn't very far down, but the low ceiling above the steps was frighteningly claustrophobic, and I was forced to cock my head to the side to avoid banging it on the wooden beams. I reached the bottom and found an open doorway to my right, which led into a very simple square room that, like the stairs, possessed an oppressively low ceiling and a strong, musty scent. I entered the cellar, relying upon the feeble cone of sickly yellow light emanating from the flashlight to make out any firm details from the malaise of murky darkness beyond. A large rotting wooden table served as the centerpiece of the room, and there were rows of badly handmade shelves lining the back wall, sagging and leaning at odd angles. The shelves were mostly barren, but there was evidence in the dust that a large collection of books had once stood there, and a bare steel skeleton of chemistry equipment and a few empty bottles sat on the desk. As I moved the light around, it reflected off several large bottles on another shelf to my right. Large, thick, almost barrel-like. Most were full of clear yellow liquids. Others were nut brown oil in color. A few were marked with hastily scrawled labels that read Royal Water. Beyond the collection of chemicals, there was a door that appeared to lead out of the cellar. This confused me, for I could not recall any outside entrance that led to the cellar beneath the house. The door itself looked ancient, with its rusted bolt and handle barely holding on to the crumpling wood to which they were both cruelly nailed into. As I moved closer to it, the light from the flashlight caught something carved into the frame above the door. It was that curious star hieroglyph I had seen on the stone of the grave of Francis Ellis Pendle. I ran my finger along the carving, almost as if to ascertain that it was real. As my finger traced the freakish shape, I felt a chill creep over me, the same chill that had caused me to flee from the shadows of the witch elms. This time, I refused to let the fear grip me, taking the door by its rusted handle and pushing it inward. The door did not lead to the outside of the house, but instead revealed another set of stone stairs leading further down into the earth. The odor that assaulted my senses as I took a solitary step towards those stairs was foul. It was a putrid stench, unlike anything I'd ever smelt before. If I was to describe it as an ungodly mixture of some acidic compound and rotting excrement, I would be on the verge of doing justice to that magnificent, invasive scent. I instinctively took a step back and raised my hand to cover my nose, as if it would somehow relieve me of the burden of breathing in that foul and fetid air. For a brief moment, I considered turning around and leaving the cellar, but out of burning curiosity, I slowly started to descend those awful stairs. What lay at the bottom is something that will haunt me until my final days. For laying beyond was a second chamber, not unlike the first, but whereas the above cellar had been converted into some kind of perverse amalgamation of an esoteric library and alchemist's laboratory, this hidden chamber was nothing less than the devil's workshop. Strange images were carved and painted onto the walls, many of which resembling the hieroglyphs I had seen on the meager gravestone of Francis Ellis Pendle. There was little to tie the various pictographs together. Some depicted spheres or eyeballs, others were long snake-like tendrils that curled upon themselves to create a rudimentary alien text. As I edged further into the room, I could make out various objects nailed to the ceiling. Some were rusted tools, like the kind you would find in a slaughterhouse. Others were odd assortments of twigs held together with twine, creating shapes that had a vague human outline to them. The crowning horror, however, was the table. This long stone edifice was less a desk and more like a butcher's slab, stained a hideous reddish brown all over. There were grooves carved into the table's surface, all of which culminated towards a round hole, underneath which a rusted iron bucket had been attached. It was from this bucket that the stench appeared to originate, and bending down to inspect its contents, I could see the glistening, rotting hind limb of a dog. Maggots wriggled across its surface, burrowing in and out of the putrid flesh. I felt bile rise in my throat, but I managed to keep it down and continue my investigation. Like the room above, there were shelves fitted to the walls, but these were not bare, instead being filled to the brim with various manuscripts, papers, maps, and glass jars. The whole scene had an unmistakable sense of the bygone laid over it, as if it had sat here undisturbed for centuries. Among the papers and jars, I found a small linen bag tied to a piece of string. A brown stain on the bag's underside made me think twice about opening it, but I eventually found the courage to do so. Inside were numerous small white objects that looked like tiny stones. But upon tipping the bag's contents out and inspecting them with the flashlight, I found to my horror that they were children's teeth. By the time the smell was becoming unbearable, and I had no wish to linger further, Deciding to abandon my investigation, I spied a small, frayed notebook left on the right-hand side of what I now thought of as a vivisectionist table. For whatever reason I could not then fathom, the curious woodblock image on the front must have caught my eye, and I picked the book up and tucked it into my jacket before making my way back to the sanity of the house above. I immediately removed my jacket and threw it on the kitchen table, disgusted that the terrible stench from below had somehow attached itself to me like a parasite. I then methodically opened up all the windows in the house, hoping that the chill air would purify the hideous odor that had made a nest for itself in my nostrils. Tired, my poor mind swirling from the revelations of that hypogean realm, I eventually collapsed onto my bed and succumbed to exhaustion. I cannot say how long I had been slumbering when the first of those terrible dreams came to me. My sense of time had been grossly warped by my exploration in the cellar, but it must have been quite sudden, as the sun was still in the sky when I finally jolted awake, my pillow wet with sweat. It is impossible for me to tell if the dreams were brought on by Stefan's final letters, or if the hidden chamber below the house had awoken something macabre and unwelcome in my imagination. I found myself standing within the cemetery outside, only it was different. The land around me was sparser, with fewer tombstones jutting out of the soft, mossy ground. The gunner's cloth lay before me, its outline far more feral and foreboding than it had any right to be. The sky above me was a blackened abyss, punctured by thousands of twinkling stars that glittered and gleamed from the great beyond. The fat silver moon slowly crept above the tree line, casting its pale white light upon the cemetery, causing long, deep shadows to detach from the headstones and crawl upon the ground towards me. I took a few steps back, but they still found me, chilling as they swept over my feet, legs, and body. Then, out of the tangled briars he came, hopping out of the brambles, the awful form of Saltpeter. On 3 legs he danced, the sleek body of a greyhound, upon the neck of which there leaned and swayed the head of a cat. His eyes were milky orbs, faintly illuminated like phosphorus toadstools. From his feline jaws there dripped a reddish clear syrup that hissed as it hit the sanctified ground of the graveyard. He momentarily ceased his insistent frolicking to scratch himself, but I could see that it was missing the back legs that was attempting the impossible task. A raw, bloody stump that justified feebly towards the source of his irritation. Then, beyond the twitching imp, I could see another figure, a man. Even at this distance, I could make out the repulsive details of his form. He was tall and thin, his long, slender fingers like twigs. His lengthy nose and sunken eyes were clearly visible through the cemetery gloom. Worst of all, a sardonic and wolfish grin lay stretched across his face. There was a hunger in that smirk, a dark and terrible burning hunger. Then Saltpeter ceased his scratching, and in a hollow voice that somehow sounded like my mother's, spoke these words.
"Come, child, come. We have marmalade and marzipan, and all manner of baked treats for you. We have seed cakes and toffee apples, all that your heart desires. Come with me into the forest, and I will show you delights beyond your dreams."
I felt myself pulled towards those honeyed words. All the while, the tall, sinister man said nothing, only grinning at me from beneath his wide-brimmed hat. I can't, I stuttered. It's dark, and my mother will want me home for supper,
Supper.
replied Saltpeter, his rotting pale tongue licking across his chops.
Oh, we shall have supper. Won't we, master?
The imp then looked up towards the terrible man, who stayed silent while nodding his head in agreement. I tried once more to turn away, but my feet were spellbound, marching me towards what I knew would be my demise. "Mother!" I cried out. "Mother, please! I'm scared!" The terrible man laughed as Saltpeter rubbed himself upon his master's blood-stained breeches, a wheezing purr emanating from his twisted form. "Mother!" I cried out once more, the words mercifully pulling me back from the precipice of my dreamless madness. "Mother!" I whimpered, awake now, and once more in my bed. To say that the dream, the nightmare, had unnerved me would be a lie. In fact, it would be all I could think of for the next few days. I did not dare to sleep again on that first day, and instead plied myself with the strong Turkish coffee that Stefan had kept hidden away for special guests. When I finally did succumb to sleep the next day, my dreams were less vivid and mercifully brief. I felt the presence of Saltpeter and the terrible man on several occasions, but managed to awaken myself before they could make themselves known. I also dreamt often of the gunner's cloth and the outer copse of wych elm trees that lay beyond. The manuscript I had taken from the hidden cellar chamber lay forgotten on the kitchen table during this haunted time, until by chance, a week or so later, I happened to find it beneath a small pile of local newspapers that Ted had been collecting. I was once again taken aback by the grotesque, demonical woodblock printing on the front of the manuscript. Sitting down and inspecting further, I could see roughly a dozen or so figures depicted in the image. Most were what I would describe as crones and hags, many of them riding upon the backs of black goats and other less discernible creatures. Various furtive, demonic characters were also shown, some of them dancing and copulating with the crones in disgusting details. Around them were various smaller figures. I guess you would call them imps or familiars of varying anatomy. Many of the figures were oddly named, the text appearing next to them to be what I took for some form of early English, queer titles such as Pyewacket, Grizzle Greedygut, and Peak in the Crown. But one of the odious creatures had a name next to its image that caused my heart to jump in my chest for a moment. The image was that of a three-legged hound bearing the head of a cat. Next to the beast lay the words Saltpeter. I paused for a moment, images of that terrible nightmare playing out in my mind like a perverse pantomime. I glanced back at the yellowed manuscript. There was no title on the front, so I slowly peeled back the first page, and there, printed in bold black, lay the words, the Sussex manuscript, Cultus Maleficarum. No author or date appeared anywhere on the front or back of the manuscript, but as I flicked through, it opened on a section roughly half of the way through. This particular chapter must have been referenced many times, for the manuscript almost appeared to want to open to this point. I glanced down and saw the title, Calling Upon Thy Black Imp. It almost looked like something out of a cookbook, a repulsive recipe that was half profane culinary instruction and half magical incantation. Odious images accompanied the next page, showing a gnarled crone briefly chopping up the bodies of rabbits, cats, and dogs, and calves with an oversized meat cleaver. I decided to put the manuscript in the kitchen drawer next to Stefan's letters and did my best to banish its foul images from my mind. Days and then weeks passed by, and eventually I managed to put most of the past behind me regarding the horrid manuscript, as well as Stefan and his strange turn of personality. The dreams lingered for a while, but eventually they released me from their grip, and my sleep grew more restful. I resumed my duty as a stand-in vicar with a renewed gusto and opened the church. At first, the locals were slow to return, but as word spread, my Sundays were soon busy, and I found myself welcoming faces new and old to my service. I allowed myself to forget about all of the talk of black magic and imps and witches that had plagued my return to the village, and instead focused on serving my community, with the help of a few curates appointed by the bishop to assist me. I even found the courage to descend once more into the cellar and bricked up the entrance that led to the hidden room beyond. Thoughts of Stefan still occasionally crept into my mind, of course, typically in the form of short dreams I still experience from time to time. But these were less disruptive than my prior nightmares, being less sinister in nature. I resigned myself to the awful truth that I may never see or hear from Stefan again, and so spent more time with my mother and rekindled a few friendships in the village that had grown cold whilst I was away studying. I grew keenly aware that I was being groomed by the diocese to replace Stefan as the parish priest, and struggled with my conflicting feelings on the matter. I managed, however, to develop a firm mental robustness that permitted me to carry on with my new daily routine, growing my flock and welcoming the Lord's light and forgiveness into the hearts and minds of my community. Sadly, this period of respite would abruptly end with an event that was singular in its horror and absurdity. It's an event that, at a certain time in my life, I would have welcomed wholeheartedly, but it was now one that filled me with an inescapable cold dread. For the first time since returning to Barton, I finally received word from Stefan, a note that plunged my mind back into madness. The letter was from Stefan, but it wasn't obvious to me immediately, as it lacked not only the hallmarks of his handwriting, but also that of any normal, sane human being. The writing was a mere scribble, childish and scratchy. The cramped script appeared as if it had been fighting with itself as it spilled onto the page in a vain effort to form some kind of discernible legibility. The paper itself was also odd. It appeared to have been torn from a book, as the printed stamp, property of Barton Library, appeared on the opposite side. The paper was also slightly damp, with water stains and strange grit-like sediment dotted around the written words. The content of the note, as best as I care to remember, was as follows.
Ben, don't have long before these hands are not mine. Manage to make it back to my body. I could feel him pulling me back to his. Don't think I can escape again. I will try. Do one last thing for me. I beg you. Beneath the tree. I am beneath the tree and in pain. His spirit is free now. It wants you. My body is no longer suitable. Yours is better. I beg you, dig up the earth under the tree. Take what you find beneath and burn it. Not fire. Must be acid. Take the royal water and drench his remains in it. None of the essential salts can survive. Do you understand? He can return if you use fire. Dying slowly in the ground. I cannot stand the blackness anymore. I am myself for a few moments, back here in my own rotting body to write and bring you this note. Soon I must return to the soil. My own fault. I called him, and he answered. I'm so sorry for bringing you into this madness. Do as I ask.
The note must have been hand-delivered, for it lacked a stamp or even an address on it. It was simply a folded-up piece of paper with Ben scrawled on the front of it in the same spidery penmanship. I needed some fresh air to clear my mind after reading the baffling note, and took a brisk walk through the village. The vanishing sun was pleasant enough, but it was punctured cruelly by a cutting wind that caused my skin to shrivel with goosebumps. The village was quiet, and I saw only a few locals as I walked a loop around the village, starting at Townfield Lane and then along Runcorn Road, and finally back to Leader Lane and towards the church. There was so much chaos flowing in my mind that upon returning home, I simply collapsed into a chair at the kitchen table and lay my head down. It weighed heavily upon my mind that Stefan was out there somewhere, either a drooling madman or the victim of some black sorcery that I could barely bring myself to give credence to. But if God and his mighty kingdom were real, as I had been raised to believe, then surely the devil and all the denizens of the pit must be also. This affair did not strike me as madness. There was a revolting authenticity to it, not to mention an alien element that my mind struggled to grapple with in its complexity. As the sun sank upon that day and gave birth to the inevitable darkness, I found myself drawn to the decanter of brandy that Stefan had kept in the lounge and indulged myself heartily of its warming contents. The fire conjuring in my throat by the liquor was very much welcomed, and by the time I had polished off a fourth glass, I was very much under the sway of hypnosis and carried myself numbly to my bed. For the first time in weeks, the dreams returned. I tossed and turned all night, unable to settle. My brain buzzed with 1,000 thoughts as half-imagined fears danced in my mind's eye. There was a horrid semi-realization that my slumbering form was being watched, and more than a few times, I felt my spirit lift out of my body and float above my bed. From this observation point, I could see a dark figure standing in the shadowed corner of my room, his eyes glaring at my sleeping body with an alien hunger. I saw Saltpeter, that hideous abomination, leap upon my bed and paw playfully at my lips.
This one will do nicely.
The imp spoke, once more in a voice that sounded like my mother's.
This one, master. And then we are free.
When the morning sun blissfully shined through my bedroom curtains, I was able to banish the night's dread back to whatever foul pit it had spawned from. But each night they returned. I held sermons for the following fortnight, designed more to comfort myself than my community. I spoke with a fiery conviction of how Jesus had defeated both death and the devil, and how with his love, there was no evil on the earth that could not be banished. This settled my nerves somewhat, but the comfort or normalcy that I craved eluded me. A few days after receiving this crude note, I learned with great dismay that Stefan's body had been found on the Blackcroft Heath. Though his bloated corpse had been discovered some distance away from both the canal and the nearby river, the coroner ruled his cause of death as drowning. The funeral shortly followed, and I decided to lead the service, despite the bishop offering to take that burden from me. The turnout was higher than I expected, which comforted me, and I even saw my mother shed a few tears for our village's departed vicar. Eventually, with both the terrible dreams and Stefan's demise weighing upon me, I made the decision to step down from the parish and leave the church entirely. What had once been a dream was rapidly transforming into an unending nightmare. I planned to leave Barton altogether, to never again step foot within its haunted streets. I had concluded that the village was not a good place to linger and made plans to relocate to Manchester. This decision, final and resolute in my mind, did manage to bring some comfort, and I allowed myself to hope that this whole affair would one day be behind me. I didn't inform the bishop. I was concerned that he would try to convince me to stay. I gave myself no longer than 2 months to wrap up my affairs and then inform the diocese of my decision. As fate would have it, that decision, along with many others, was stolen from me on that awful night that was to come. The renewed sense of peace brought on by my impending resignation and relocation might have lasted, had that crowning horror not invaded my world on that dark December night. I had retired to bed early, but the constant lashing of the rain had been relentless all day and was set to continue throughout the night. I slept fitfully, and in sporadic episodes of thrashing, for I was experiencing the most vivid and horrible dream imaginable. I dreamt of being confined, bound in the darkness. My arms worked, but my legs felt numb and lifeless. I struggled ceaselessly to remove myself from this foul bondage, but my body felt like some spindly marionette whose strings had become tangled around my fingers, cutting off the blood flow and leaving them numb and useless. After what seemed like an eternity, I somehow managed to muster what little strength I had and force my form through the cracks of my prison. I dreamt of pushing upwards, forever upwards, past the rotting wood and the soft wet earth, past the worms and the matted tangles of endless roots, and finally to the cold, rain-lashed surface above. I awoke suddenly with that last thought, sat upright in bed with cooling sweat pouring down my back. But it wasn't the dream that had startled me awake. As my senses adjusted, I could hear that it was the ringing of the church bells that had mercifully returned my mind from the abyss. The clear and familiar sound of ringing bells pierced through the night, and I glanced at my clock to see it was just past 3 a.m. The witching hour, I thought. I jumped out of bed and grabbed my dressing gown. No doubt the noise would eventually awaken the entire village, and I would be to blame. I raced down the stairs and bolted out of the kitchen door into the chill of the night. I barely noticed the cold rain pelting my face as I ran towards the church. My slippers greedily soaked up the muddy water that pooled around my footsteps, and I shuddered as the cold, damp muck sank in between my toes. Determined to stop the commotion, I fumbled with my keys, but the door was already ajar, and I pushed it open and made my way to the main hall in the direction of the bell chamber. By the time I reached the door, the ringing had mysteriously stopped, and I slowed down my pace. As I bent over to catch my breath, I noticed a disgusting trail of mud and slime snaking its way from the doorway and through the hall. It seemed to lead directly to where I was headed. I kneeled and swiped my fingers through the baffling sludge. It possessed a carnal stench, not unlike that fetid aroma that had sickened me in the cellar that terrible day. I immediately pulled a handkerchief from my gown pocket and wiped that horrid jelly from my fingers as best I could. I was determined to find out the cause of the ringing, but it crept over me that there were perhaps a mundane yet unnerving explanation. Suppose someone had broken in and was using the bells as a diversion while an accomplice robbed my home, I thought. Still, as much as I would have liked to accept this solution as fact, I felt compelled to investigate the muddy trail. There was little of value in the house that a thief could steal, and even if that was true, I had no desire to confront a burglar in the dead of night. I therefore slowly entered the tenebrous chamber that housed the bell ropes beyond the main hall. There was a feeble sliver of light that gleamed through the window from the street lamps outside, and I could just make out the basic parameters of the chamber. I was certain that no one else was in the room, and I carefully walked deeper in the darkness to inspect the 6 ropes. All were unmoving except one, which swayed gently in the dark. Just like the floor outside, there was a smear of foul-smelling mud over the ground, as well as on the moving rope. I placed my hand upon it and stopped it swaying. Then, just as I was considering leaving, I suddenly became aware of a shape on the ground in the far left corner. My eyes were still adjusting to the dark of the room, but at first I fancied it looked like a mud-stained bundle of rags and twisted sticks. But as I inspected further, a creeping horror washed over me, along with a terrible recognition of what I was seeing. What did I see? That is at once an easy and a difficult question to answer, and perhaps at the crux of this whole affair. For lying on the ground in front of me, face, or should I say skull, pressed to the stone floor, was an ancient collection of decaying bones and mummified flesh. Chunks of stinking, sodden earth and flayed, tattered skin were wrapped around the grisly mound of necrosis. It was a brown, spindly thing, more bone than meat, with a whitish, cracked dome for a head. Wrapped around its spine, close to what once passed for a neck, was the rotted, damp rope of the hangman's noose. It was then I heard a muffled and strange sound emanating from the skeletal horror that lay at my feet. It was at once a whisper and a growl, human and bestial, disembodied and echoing all around me, yet at the same time focused upon that mass of rags and fused bone. The noise changed into a cry that shook the very foundation of my soul, for the voice was that of Stephen Adams. The corpse thing before me issued forth a single sentence before growing still and silent once more.
Ben, for the love of God, please.
Those who have bothered to speak to me at any length know the rest of my story. Half mad and howling with a volatile mixture of fear and fury, I retrieved the yellow chemicals from the basement and, together with the rotting bundle, threw their contents into the self-exhumed grave of Francis Ellis Pendle. At some point, 2 police officers accosted me, but I managed to overcome them and continue my grisly task, dissolving the whole mess into acrid sludge. I watched it bubble and froth into the black soil as the earth reluctantly absorbed the disgusting mass. Despite the obvious horror, I felt a great relief wash over me. The chaos of the past few months of my life came sharply into view, like a knot unraveling before me. Madness gave way to clarity. Though this is the end of my account, it's not the end of the matter. For there was no doubt in my mind that beneath that lonesome wych elm, beneath the cold earth of that hidden grave, the soul of my dear friend, Stephen Adams, had lain incarcerated for months in silent torment. He had called up the wicked soul of his ancestor for whatever purpose I can now only guess at. He had not been strong enough to put down that which he had called forth and paid for it with his life and soul. A terrifying spiritual transfusion had taken place. Pendle had taken Stephen's body, and Stephen had been forced into Pendle's. At some point, Stephen had managed to take control of his own body long enough to hurl it into the churning waters of the river, hoping to end that evil which had made a home for itself within him. Stephen had been reduced to a mere consciousness, as Pendle's spirit roamed freely, as the witch set about renewing his coven and conjuring up his black imps. Stephen's sentient mind, fully aware with its senses intact, understood with abominable clarity that it now inhabited the 200-year-old corpse of Francis Ellis Pendle. He who had been hung for his crimes against God and King, he who had sought to bargain with the devils of the sky and the earth, he who had slept relentlessly beneath the dark soil of the gunner's cloth, his presence felt by all who dare enter. He who had dreamt of nothing but the torment and wickedness he would unleash upon the descendants of those who had delivered him to his grave, dreams of vengeance and dark oaths, those terrible dreams of blasphemy and madness, the dreams beneath the witch tree. Hey everybody, I hope you're doing well. I'm sorry that it's been a few months since my last upload. I wanted to post something because I do have a few things that are almost done, including like a special anniversary video for my 1000th video. But I just wanted to post something to let you all know that I'm still here, because I've been seeing posts on the subreddit asking if I'm even alive and stuff. And I just wanted to, say hi, yes, I'm still here, and just give you a little bit of information about why I've been gone for so long. So I have had to have a bunch of family members move in with me, and I haven't had an office in a few months. It's been really hard to find a space to actually do recordings. In fact, I don't even have my microphone arm right now, so I'm just holding my microphone up to my face with one hand and the pop filter in front of the microphone with the other, so it doesn't sound like trash, but hopefully there's not like too much rumbling or anything for me holding the microphone. The other thing I've been experiencing is I've been having daily episodes of extremely bad mental health. I won't give too many details on it, but it's something I used to be on medication for, but stopped because it got better. Probably because the medication wasn't a good idea to stop taking it. But I'm getting back on it. But anyway, that's another reason, unfortunately, it's been so hard for me to get things done, because when these episodes happen, I can't really do anything at all. And like I said, I won't give much more detail than that. And I don't say all this stuff to try to give like excuses as to why I haven't been posting. I'm just trying really to let you all know where I've been, what's been going on, and why videos haven't really been being posted. But things are getting better. But anyway, I just wanted to let you know I am still here. I do have new stuff being worked on. I am going to be posting 2 videos that are almost done. One's called Beneath the Witch Tree, and then I don't want to give the title of the other one because it's going to be a surprise. And then I'm going to do a few feature videos with Dusklight Radio, Romnex, and Spirit Voices. But yeah, like I said, I just wanted to post something so I can let you all know that I am still here, I'm still around. I haven't quit the channel or anything like that. But I also wanted to say that I've noticed there are a few other channels who have started uploading, my videos and like naming their channels, the Dark Somnium podcast or like the Dark Somnium whatever. I just want to let you know the only channels on YouTube that I have right now are this one and Somnium Music. So any other channel you see that has my videos on it, it's not me. But then I do also have the podcast like on Spotify and iTunes and all that stuff. But yeah, I will probably post some more information in the comment section just about what's been going on. I just didn't want to get into too many details. But anyway, thank you all so much for your support during this time and being patient with me. This community means the world to me, and no, I'm not giving up or quitting or anything like that. With that said, enjoy this video. This is just a compilation I wanted to post up for you all. I hope you have a great day.
Okay, let me get straight to the point. I do not believe for 1 second that no other child played the bath game growing up. I'm convinced my friends are trolling me, but they're not responding to my messages, and so I'm left with little choice but to bring my question here, hoping someone will know what the hell I'm talking about. I was around 5 or 6 when my babysitter introduced the idea of the bath game to me. She said it was a fun way to engage the imagination and that I could find something truly special within the water. I didn't question it, even then, because she was the boss and I thought she was pretty. I didn't want to make her mad by refusing or risk having my Nintendo taken away if I was disobedient. So when my mom told her to bathe me one night, I was excited to try it. Her instructions were pretty simple, and I'd come to write them down because with any game, there has to be rules. 1. You must do the bath game alone. These instructions can be given, but you have to be isolated for the game to begin. 2. The tub should have some sort of thick bath soap that includes a lot of suds and a dark liquid. Ensure the top of the water is obscured and the sides are caked in it, including the handles to get out. 3. Only hot water. No cold and no resistance upon getting into the water. If it hurts, it will pass as your skin gets used to it. Ignore any reddening on the skin. 4. Take a deep breath. Make sure it hurts a little and know that you will not be coming back up for a while. 5. Dive in and don't look back or rise up. Allow the current to take you and keep your eyes open. 6. Your vision will blur, but it will eventually clear and you'll see something in the plug hole. Go to it. 7. Trust in what you see. Let your body relax. 8. When you meet the Sea Emperor and the lights above the water go out, you've won the bath game and you can come up for air. The babysitter was so excited she could barely contain herself, bouncing around and eyes wide, a thick liquid flowing from her eyes. She didn't even bother wiping it up, content to be sharing in my submersion by proxy. I stood there in my bath towel, expecting her to follow me in, but she shook her head, nostrils flaring.
Only you. Rule 1, remember?
She beamed, and I felt my face grow hot. She was so pretty when she stared at me like that, I'd have done anything.
You're special. I can't wait for you to win and get your prize.
What do I get? I was eager, but I had to know. What kid doesn't love prizes? Her lip twitched, and she took a moment to answer, but I remember her expression never changed, not once. Her teeth chattered as she said one word.
Freedom!
I had no idea what she meant, but in my mind I assumed, like any child, it was gaming all night, eating what I wanted, and no school. What kid wouldn't want that? I went in and noticed the bath was already running. A thick black soup I'd used to give myself foam beards was caking the entire tub, save for one spot to safely get in. The water was so hot that it was steaming up the mirror and making my body sweat. Rules 2 and 3 were taken care of, it seemed. A little freaked out, but unperturbed, I took a couple of practice breaths before inhaling deep. Feeling the pressure mount and slowly stepping into the tub, careful not to let my feet slip. Even at that age, I knew I could easily hit my head on the faucet and cave my skull in. Nothing was going to stop me from winning this game. The water looked inviting, but murky. The thick paste had covered the top in a layer of foam with small patches of black liquid poking through. The bottom obscured and creating an illusion of depth. As my feet touched the water, I felt the searing heat ripple through my skin, threatening to tear at the flesh. But you'd be amazed how determined a child can be when a prize is up for grabs. I decided, in my infinite wisdom, that I'd brave it in one go. I exhaled and let my body up to my neck sink down, the pain enough to make me yelp and try to get out, but after a couple of moments, I took in one final deep breath and pushed on, submerging myself fully. Eyes burned and senses dulled in the inky, hot blackness. It felt like swimming through tar, but as the rules suggested, ignoring it was the only way forward. My stomach pushed in protest and my muscles began to burn, but I focused on letting the current take me, not even questioning how a current was a thing in a bathtub. But I did wonder, was it always this wide and deep? I focused on the sinkhole and saw long, scaled hands protruding from either side, the nails sharp and cracked, soft flesh flapping in the water, coming off in small chunks. It started pushing at the edges of the sinkhole and widening it, my body steadily being pulled towards it as the light above darkened and the burning in my chest became less of a problem. In fact, everything in my body relaxed, and all I had to do was float. I saw into the sinkhole, and it took many years of reflection with an adult mind to figure out what I experienced as a child. Words still fail me 30 years later. They're inadequate and unable to capture the beauty below. A sprawling obsidian city meshed into coral reefs, the pulsated colors I recognized and many I'd never seen before or since. The further I descended, the more blinding the eyes got, as if they were guiding me to land. Further down, at the entrance to the city, 2 large statues loomed on either side of a grand throne. They're imposing, pilot lights swinging on their skulls, orbs for eyes and mouths in places they shouldn't be, one holding the tip of a sword with several spikes running the hilt, the other a grand hammer. It's when I see the throne that I feel the burning in my chest return and something pulling me back and up. It's empty, and yet it's not. Something is sitting upon it, but it isn't. A flickering image, or perhaps my eyes deemed it too much to bear full witness to, but I felt it in that moment. It knew I was disobeying the rules and saw fit to punish me. It craned its horrific skull up towards me, and as it smiled, the eyes blinded me, filling my body with such agony that my ribs felt as if they would snap under the pressure. The eardrums burst and skulls split open. I felt as if I was dying. The next memory I have was being in a hospital bed, unable to speak, and a tube down my throat. I was beyond terrified to be hooked up to machines, and even more scared that I'd let down the babysitter, that the creature in the sinkhole was coming for me. I thrashed around until my mom's concerned face came into focus and she soothed me. Tears stained my face, and I was faced with the long recovery, both physically and mentally. Therapists came and went. None of them believed the bath game was real. Every single one of them told me without fail that my babysitter was simply mentally unwell, had tried to manipulate me and drown me, that all I'd seen was my oxygen-starved brain. But I knew better. Even when she was sentenced to a mental institution and apologized for deceiving me, I knew better. I never deviated from that one pervasive thought that burrowed into my brain like a parasite. I'd failed the game. I bring this all up because I know someone has experienced this. They have to have seen it. It's too specific for one person out of 7.5 billion to have gone through. Does nobody remember the way the tub expanded when you dove in? The widening sinkhole with great hands? The weird, indescribable lights of the coral reefs beneath the tub? The fishmen statues holding artifacts of power? The sea emperor that resides between realities? Everyone in Sturgeon says I'm crazy. They don't believe me, but I'll have proof for them soon. I tried recreating the game myself over the years, but maybe my failure was simply too egregious and the Emperor simply won't allow me to retake it. I've caught glimpses in the steamed-up mirrors, though, promises of what could be if I just show the resolve to go there again. Thankfully, my son can do it for me. He's so excited, having grown up on the stories of what lays beneath the sinkhole in the bathtub. I made him wait until he was older to undertake the game. I had to ensure if he told others, they wouldn't think him too young. I sent him in about a half hour ago. I can only hope the fact he hasn't returned is proof he met the Sea Emperor, but he shouldn't be there much longer, right? I want to go check on him, but because I lost, I don't think I'm permitted to interfere. I even stood outside the door, ready to pull on the handle, but my legs won't stop shaking. I feel my throat close up and sweat run down my head. Perhaps it's a sign not to interfere. Please, someone, anyone, tell me I'm not crazy, that I'm not alone. Someone has to remember the bath game, because as my mind wanders and fear creeps in, all I can think of is the prize my babysitter promised, the prize my son has been promised. Freedom. The days all started with the briefing room, a wall-to-wall palette of aged pastels and stark hospital grayness. In the center of our little room, an oval-shaped table dominated the space, with every seat filled with a tired nurse. From one of the windows, a bar of morning light often slipped stubbornly past the shutters. It was this drab room where we discussed things such as the population of our current patients and whether to up or down their medications. In a work environment prone to shifting each and every day, such meetings were vital to maintain the facility's pulse. As I sipped my morning coffee and slid the bitter warmth down my throat, I could not help but eye the newest face of our staff, a young man with a sharp, short haircut and a stony, unsmiling face. Alec Barnes, a pest. Throughout the entirety of our meetings, he could never just keep quiet, to sit and listen as we resolved any daily conflicts. No, he had to chime in every moment he could, bringing everything to a grinding halt to interject with, "I have to disagree. Well, where I come from, we did this. If I could just stop you there." A pest indeed. Every clinic had at least one of his sort, hungry to get out there and feel out the unit they'd soon be running. We affectionately referred to them as Weisenheimers, those who can do no wrong, instant virtuosos of the field. These people were easy enough to spot, postures tense with self-conviction, nodding impatiently as you speak to them, as though already knowing what you're about to say and that you are simply moving too slow for their patience. And you, only you, are the one doing things wrong. I can still recall one in particular, a young know-it-all who had become a nuisance during our labs and clinicals, chattering in on how we'd been doing everything incorrectly and not by the books. That is, until one day I'd spied the bag of dopamine she'd secured for a patient draining itself into their sheets. The sheets. Never faster had I seen one's face flush so red. And what happens to that self-importance after moments like this? They are jettisoned out, left to the scorn of those they'd obnoxiously reprimanded. And you can bet your bottom dollar Alec Barnes will get his eventually. Reality has a way of compressing our egos. After the meeting had finished and the charge nurse had assigned our patient loads for the days, I set out to complete my daily tasks. Within the confines of our 25-bed unit, our patients mostly consisted of those recovering from injury, whether accidental or purposefully inflicted, and most patients were more of a danger to themselves than others. That being said, there were always those we had to be wary of. In my years as a psychiatric nurse, I'd been kicked, scratched, bitten, punched, and for the better half of a day, verbally threatened. Still, I never let it sodden my spirits, no matter how much saliva or curses were hawked at me. Contrary to how social media or cinematic horrors may portray them, psychiatric wards are not twisted places littered with crazies. They are places of healing, of alleviation, a haven for those physically alive but internally tormented. Yes, some kicked and shrieked in the halls until their throats split, but a good deal held a much quieter, unseen pain. That was why I was there, to help ease the cold terrors of their futures. And for the case of our newest arrival, Roland Boole would become my next big project. It was raining on the night they brought him in. I spied him rolling by on a stretcher, his cold face wet and dripping. His eyes flickered with transient consciousness, perhaps barely grasping the shapes and sounds around him. For a moment, we actually held each other's gaze as he was whisked away to the intensive care unit. 10 paper clips, 8 marbles, and 5 drywall nails. These were the objects removed from Mr. Boole's stomach. He was diagnosed with pica, an uncommon disorder in which one has the urge to ingest inedible objects, though one this severe was especially rare. Encompassing that fact, he'd also been diagnosed with depressive disorder, severe anxiety, and post-traumatic stress. Despite my history in the psychiatric field, I could not help but feel woefully unprepared for him. If only I had even the slightest clue. I stopped at Mr. Boole's door, surveyed my notes once more, and carefully let myself inside. The room was reminiscent of a college dorm, with a single window providing a glossy view of the parking lot. Mr. Boole was awake and currently hunched over his table, a wilderness of hanging, stringy hair covering his face. His legs were crossed at the ankles, both shoelaces removed. He appeared to be writing vigorously into a crossword puzzle with one of our rubber ballpoint pens. I knocked lightly towards the door, which prompted him to turn toward me. "Good morning, Mr. Boole." I smiled as I introduced myself. "How are you doing today?" From out of the mesh of hair, a thin face stared back at me, giving a look I'd describe only as a tight-lipped vacancy. Eyes wide as possible, but not quite focused. He appeared somewhere north of his 50s. From across his chin and up his cheeks, a scattering of scars was etched into his features. Possible self-harm, my thoughts mused. I continued my greeting. "My name is Jason, and I'm one of the registered nurses here to ensure everything is all right and that your time with us is a good one. Is there anything I can help you with?" His eyes held tired water behind them, inspecting me up and down, trying to get a read on me as I was him. His mouth then pulled into a small grin, which rumpled the stretch marks. "You have piano fingers." "I'm sorry?" I asked, caught off guard by his statement. He lifted his hand and flexed his fingers. "Piano fingers. Father had them too. He used to play all the time in his office, mostly the gymnopédies and a tad of Chopin. Do you play at all?" Despite his craggy appearance, his voice carried a genuine playfulness behind it. "Not at all," I chuckled. "My mother had one of her friends give me lessons when I was younger, but unfortunately, none of them stuck." Yes, Mrs. Brown was an avid teacher of the arts, but now I could only remember the reek of bone broth carrying her breath. "Anyhow, it was nice officially meeting you. Please don't hesitate to let me know if you need anything. We'll do everything we can to help." "Of course," he answered, rubbing a finger along his scarf-fringed chin. It was not long before we realized the true extent that Mr. Boole needed to be monitored. From the television room, he'd plucked out the power button, as well as both volume buttons from the remote, and swallowed their small plastic bodies. From his bathroom, he'd twisted the cap off of one of the soap dispensers and negotiated it down his throat. And before we could catch it, he'd already swallowed the Flexipen we'd given him for crosswords. As arrangements were made to have them removed, we mulled over different treatment options for his condition. In most cases, pica was caused by an iron deficiency in the body, leaving it craving something to replenish the lacking minerals. Therefore, we prescribed him an iron supplement. After a few weeks of the dosage, 2 tablets a day, and an iron-rich diet, his pining for non-food items had considerably lessened. I was ecstatic about the progress, thoroughly convinced that before long, his symptoms would be gone entirely. Unfortunately, I would come to find out we were only scratching the surface of Roland Boole. As far as the supplements had taken him, we'd soon discover that his hospital bracelet had gone missing, not so mysteriously. I'd come to find that he stopped taking the tablets completely, hiding them under his tongue only to spit them out later. On top of that, he'd entirely stopped eating anything we provided him. The next evening, I stopped by his room to once again check on him. Roland was yet again seated at his writing desk, his spine stiffly straight and his neck bent towards the window. A tray of food sat on the bed next to him, cold and uneaten. I scooped it up for him. "You really should eat something, Mr. Boole, otherwise they'll have us give you a feeding tube. The food is much better, trust me." He didn't acknowledge me, merely holding that gaze toward the grayish smear of asphalt outside. Protests like this weren't out of the ordinary, especially for patients coping with anxiety and severe depression. As I turned to report back on his state, a thin, withered voice crept out of him.
It's coming.
His lips were shaking. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to dissect what he'd just said. "What is coming?" But it was no use. He'd returned to silence, maintaining the glazed stare out the window. Evidently, our conversation had ended. That same evening, a scream resonated down the halls. It was coming from Mr. Boole's room. I was the first to arrive, quickly bursting through the door and witnessing him flailing in his sheets. His hands clawed and grasped at nothing, while his thick heels kicked helplessly about. Assessing the situation, I tried talking him down first, to calm his nerves behind the frenzied cries. He was unresponsive, lips curled back from his gums and his eyes squirming wildly in their sockets. Then, in a quick motion, his thrashing hands converged and closed around his throat, locking into a death grip. I moved to pry his hands off him, trying to carefully break the chokehold he had on himself. Even with his throat being wrung in his own grip, a pressed scream still squeezed its way out. As his grip started to slacken, the howling was suddenly stopped and replaced by the telltale sign of someone about to retch. Not wanting him to vomit flat on his back, I moved to push his body to the side, all the while looking eagerly towards the doorway to see if more help had arrived. But as I turned back toward him, everything stopped. My heart increased to a dreadful acceleration. I tried to take a breath, but couldn't. There is something so dark and different when an unspeakable shock hits you, like every nerve in your body, every sensory input to the outside world has suddenly been cut. Your voice is too brittle to speak. Your eyes are too afraid to close. Things, perhaps semblances of thoughts, beat desperately toward your brain, only to drown before reaching its surface. It had happened so quickly I could only barely process the ghostly outline of Roland's face or the sudden misshapen lump in his throat. Fingers, long, wet fingers were gleaming between his teeth, reaching outward from the dark, pink depths. They were bruised with blackish, purple colors. Strings of shiny spittle stretched and snapped between their wriggling joints. A pungent, bacterial odor reeked from their gangrene tips. Roland's eyes rolled upward as his body heaved and let out a wretched gargle. The fingers bent forward, curling over his face like a spider on its backside, and began to tug at his jaws, trying to pull them wider. Their jagged, split nails scraped across his chin, his cheeks, his nose, digging grooves into his flesh. The sound of footsteps entering the room brought me back. Another nurse had arrived. I peered once again at Roland's face, coated now in a webwork of fresh, bleeding wheals. No fingers, none at all. Together, the other nurse and I restrained Roland and safely injected him with a dose of B52, 2 mg Ativan, and 5 mg Haldol in one needle, 50 mg Benadryl in the other. With the collective effort of 3 different drugs coursing through his system, the struggles finally ceased. "A lot of damage," the other nurse commented, surveying the marks on his face. "We should have put him under long before this." I realized then that the help was none other than Alec Barnes, the Weisenheimer. Whatever he said next never reached me. I'd already left to get some ointments for Roland's cuts. I didn't sleep well that night, dozing in and out without any hope of catching a dream. Before long, I was awake and standing over the sink of the bathroom, both hands against the porcelain. Amidst the rubble of my thoughts, my brain was scavenging for answers, something that could explain what had transpired. But the answers came up short. There wasn't enough substance to it, not enough material to grasp onto. I could only imagine those fingers, their rotting pores, their twitching knuckles jutting out of a man's mouth, trying to hoist an even larger something out of the tube of his throat. The image made my insides feel wretched and rolled a brief nausea around my belly. Absurd. I snapped back at the disgusting thoughts. Ludicrous. Disgusting. Get a hold of yourself. To give such a thing credence was unacceptable. It was a stressful moment, a fabrication of a rattled mind in a stressful situation. That is the end of the matter. No further discussion required. I gargled some mouthwash, clapped both hands against my cheeks, and returned to bed, repeating the same determined tempo. But when I did finally fall asleep, there was no protecting my dreams. I was back there again, standing in Roland's room while his blurry shape screamed and writhed in the sheets. I tried to restrain him before he could harm himself, only to have my arms reel back on their own and grasp my throat instead, the last wisps of breath pulled out of me. In the pit of my gullet, something begins to move, clawing its way upward. I lurched forward, squeezing my eyes open and closed rapidly, trying to wake myself up. But it was no use. I could only retch desperately as my head flops back and the thing inside my throat forces its arrival. My eye finds the wall just as my shadow spouts a new bouquet of spidery horrors. The next time I saw Roland in person, it was during his supervised access to the outdoor patio. It was to give patients an airy reprieve outside the ward. Flower pots hung from the fence that enclosed the space, along with a wall painted into a mural and a few basketball hoops. Mr. Bull was adamant that I was the one to supervise him that day. The new scratches etched into his face had healed, breaking off into faded, fractal patterns. He took a seat at one of the diamond blue benches and sucked in a deep breath of air. Rain's on its way. You can smell it. Well, hopefully not before my drive home, I sighed, catching a whiff of it myself, the freshness just before a storm. He hummed passively, and after a short pause between us, popped the question. You saw it, didn't you? The question sent a jolt up my spine and, if only for a moment, flashed on my face. He took notice of this, the liveliness in his voice kicking up an octave. You did, didn't you? What are you referring to? I asked, rolling my shoulders back. He leaned against the thermoplastic backrest of the bench. You're scared to admit it, I get it, I do, but neither of us can be so lucky to deny it. My eyes wandered the patio, looking rather self-consciously for anyone else around. We were alone. You're going to have to be more specific for me. I'm not quite following you. His tired, watery eyes focused on me. I had to wait for you to see them before I could say anything. Otherwise, you'd never believe me. I know you wouldn't. Then his split lip curled into a smile. But if you don't listen now, you won't know what you saw, and you'll always be left to wonder. I didn't answer, but perhaps it was the absorbed look on my face that had cued for him to continue. It started with ice, he said, pausing as if to mull over that fact. I loved the texture of it, the feeling of crunching it between my teeth in tiny, crackling bits. It was one of the few things that could quell my anxiety, and when that wasn't enough, I turned to chewing on paint chips and sucking on coins for a good while. I was a very anxious boy, you see. A gust of wind whistled through the fence and bobbed the hanging flowers. His tongue lapped between his lips. I grew up in a wealthy home with wealthy parents. One of them as sweet as can be, while the other was emotionally aloof. Can you guess which one father was? He asked with a grin. The stereotypical provider, who considered the financial support to our family enough of a bond between us. Naturally, we weren't very close, and as my tendencies intensified, he and Mother were thoroughly convinced it was merely a phase. Don't ask me why it wasn't. I couldn't tell you. All I knew was that my cravings for the indigestible only grew worse as I got older. I stayed silent and listened, not daring to say anything else to throw him off point. I felt a responsibility to understand him. He'd finally opened up, no longer disappearing behind that flat stare out the window. Answers were best found during the low tide, after all. Surprisingly enough, I wasn't the only one with compulsions in our household. Roland chuckled. Father was a collector, not for coins or old dusty vinyl. He dabbed in other things. A canteen once slung over the shoulder of a dead soldier, a worn noose used to break necks in the 19th century, even an ancient skull with half its dome cleaved by some horrible means of torture. These were the things that interested him, much to my mother's dismay. Little pieces of the dark he enjoyed finding. I'm not even sure where he got his antique piano, but I know that every so often I'd hear the same 2 keys get struck in the middle of the night. So, one day, while he and Mother were away on a business trip, I'd snuck into his studio to look at the private collection myself. One of them caught my eye, a piece of jewelry that once belonged to a dead woman, said to have cursed her with an early death. I felt drawn to it, like an impulse had compelled me to believe that somehow it was mine, that it belonged to me. So, I swallowed it. A look of distress crossed him. I was scared that night, absolutely petrified that he'd come back to find the ring missing out of his collection. Then, the following night, it had passed through me. I fished it out of my waist, cleaned it intensely, and returned it back to the collection unharmed. My father was none the wiser. Soon enough, I did it again, this time with the bone of a black cat used in a witch's hex. It had started to feel like a game, but soon became more of a ritual between us. He'd bring something home, I'd swallow it, even if it was just a piece of it, wash off the blood and stool as I passed it, and place it back there. Sure, there may have been some pain and slight discoloring here and there, but never enough for him to notice. It felt good, celestial even. Father and I finally found something in common. We both had a liking for objects. His face then fell, becoming ghostly stoic as his voice lost its shape. When it came time for me to move out and on with my life, I had to put an end to our little game. He never did find out what I'd been doing to his collection, and I wouldn't have it any other way. I'd managed, or so I thought, to wean myself off of them, but as time passed, I began to have strange thoughts about all those cursed, haunted things, like how they felt suddenly different in my hands after I passed them. Almost like the energy they once held was no longer there, like it had been left behind somewhere inside me. And what if all that energy, or whatever it was they had, was then left to brew and ferment over the years, until it gestated into something else? He rubbed a pale hand over his cheek. Something that finally wants out. As his voice finally trailed off into silence, I spoke up. What do you mean by wants out, exactly? The glaze over his eyes had returned. I'd like to go back inside now, please. That was the last and longest conversation we ever had together, and he was done sharing that day. I tried to stray my thoughts away from that conversation. It was too much to digest. For the rest of that day, I no longer felt like myself inside the ward, almost like the weight there had become too crushing, like something were about to crest over the rise, and all I could do was brace for an impact I couldn't see. What happened next occurred on a late Sunday evening, 3 days after Roland Bull's unshakable silence. I was making my usual rounds in the ward and stopped by to check on him. I knocked 3 times, opened his door, and stepped routinely inside. Roland was not in his bed or stationed at his usual spot at the writing desk. The door to his bathroom was inch slightly open, the sound of a sink running coming from inside. Hey, Mr. Bull, just here to check on you. Is everything all right? I called. There was no answer. Mr. Poole, are you all right? Still nothing, only the steady drawl of running water. Without warning, the bathroom door swung open, rebounding off the rubber stop and then rebounding again off Roland Boole's body. He had blundered out backwards on his heels, both hands locked around his neck. His face was flushed into a darkish plum color. Heaps of foam dribbled out of his mouth, rolling over his lips, which had gone blue. Tears streamed out of his eyes, which bulged from their sockets. A single sound emerged from him, the gargled note of air trapped in his throat. Choking! My thoughts screamed. He's choking! I grabbed him, spinning his body around as both of my arms locked around his waist. Never in my life had I performed the Heimlich, but in that moment it was do or die. I pressed hard into his abdomen with a quick upward thrust, practically lifting him off his feet. His body jerked back, but there was no luck dislodging whatever was inside his throat. The door opened. Someone else had heard the commotion. I looked feverishly toward them while administering another ineffective thrust. The other person was none other than Alec Barnes. Even amid a panic, I despised his presence there greatly. "What's wrong? What's happening?" he asked, which only infuriated me. "Choking!" I snapped, yanking Mr. Boole back yet again. Hot blood coursed through my arms. I forced down a swallow, trying to wet my dry mouth. But in that same moment, with both my arms fastened around him, I had felt something peculiar. A sudden shift of his insides, an almost tumbling motion, far too pronounced to ignore. The Weisenheimer stepped back into my peripheral. "Let me do it, I've got it!" I hissed at him, hoisting Mr. Boole's body upward again, harder than I ever thought I could. His chest heaved as more strained gasps came out of it. Bits of his spittle slopped over my arms. He then lurched forward in my grasp. It felt as though his insides had all decompressed at once, like an airtight container being popped off. His throat opened. He let out a watery scream of pain and retching. Somewhere near us, Alec made a noise, something that sounded like, "Oh God, dear God!" Something heavy hit the floor. Roland Boole went limp in my arms. Alec Barnes let out a scream. Frantic movement skittered around the room like the sound of a fish flopping about a deck, followed by something being torn out of a wall. My eyes raced around, but the slew of everything at once had sucked all the blood from my brain, flushing its data. I checked on Roland, who had slumped over like a puppet in my arms. He was unresponsive, with his eyes staring blankly forward and lips hanging loosely open. I checked for his pulse and found no rhythm. Lying him on the ground, I lined both hands on top of the other and pumped until the strings in my wrists burned. Then I pinched his nose and forced air down his windpipe. It wasn't working. As I did this, my eyes traced the floor, following the thin film of blood and bile that trailed away from us. First to the bathroom, and then to the vanity, where the air vent below it now hung open. The right side of its grill pulled entirely out of place. Alec Barnes was frozen in his spot. The shock that distorted his face was almost too vivid to be real, and even as more staff arrived, he still remained there, stricken with fear. Roland Boole was pronounced dead by our medical examiner. The manner of death, an esophageal rupture. Several tears had perforated the walls of his throat, along with a dislocated jaw, entirely unhinged from his skull. We weren't yet sure what caused the rupture, as nothing could be traced other than the aftermath of ruined tissue. Rumors had floated around between staff of possible causes, but did not hold much water to them. Truth be told, not many of us knew how to handle the loss of a patient not otherwise terminal. As for what came of Alex Barnes, he'd quit spontaneously and left without further notice. Tried as I did to pry information out of him, he dismissed me, shaking his head and repeating that he'd seen nothing. End of story. I could see the panic in his eyes, held back by two thin sacs threatening to tear at any moment. Not a single particle of self-importance left. Perhaps I've even felt the same way, that perhaps I did catch a glimpse of something that day, a gray sleek of a shape pulling itself through the opened air duct, membranous, slug-like. But I must avert those thoughts, sort them out properly, dissect them one by one. That is the only way I can keep myself together. Yet, despite all these, the strangeness around our ward has continued to circulate. Patients have been claiming to hear something in the walls. Even some of our staff have reported it as well. A quick, insipid scratching coming from the ducts to the point where they believe an animal is trapped in there. As many times as we've had the vents checked, there is no proof for such a claim. I've heard it myself from time to time, sometimes even awfully close by, just on the other side of the duct's cover. But I do not peer inside. I do not even risk what I may see. The source of the noises. The ward's newest arrival. Just over 2 weeks ago, on Monday the 30th of August, I turned 30, and someone had to pay the price for that. Our family, the Lees, has always been seen as eccentric by the locals. Some of us have become investors, artisans, masters of niche crafts and the like. We've lived full, happy, and creatively stimulating lives, seen to the outside world as to not have a care in the world or need for anything. But we have this life at a great cost. A ritual that must be undertaken every August 30th, known collectively as the waiting game. My family has had this tradition for over 250 years. Every member of the family above the age of 18 congregates at my family's estate and spends the 48 hours prior to the event catching up, partying, and generally enjoying themselves. They are, after all living on borrowed time. When the final hours tick down to the event, they detox, ensure they've slept well, done their business, and had plenty to hydrate. Because once the clock strikes midnight, they must all stay in one room until the clock again strikes midnight. The entire time, they must keep at least one other family member in eyeshot. No single member of the family must be unaccounted for. The parlor room is structured in such a way that we can see each other no matter where we are situated in the room. Each area is well lit, comfortable, and accommodating, which, when you deal with roughly 30 people, is a necessity. You have to understand, growing up in this environment had me thinking this was simply a normal tradition every family undertook. I saw no strangeness in spending my birthday away from my family members, that it was just bad luck my birthday fell on the tradition day. That, of course, would change after I turned 11. I remember the first time I learned of the waiting game. My mother was supposed to host my birthday party, but apologized and said she wouldn't be home in time for work. To that point in my life, Mom had always worked long hours to provide for us, and it was routine. I was crestfallen, but understood. She was an art curator and loved her job with an unbridled passion. She was my hero. The fact we shared a birthday only made our bond more special in my eyes. She was a best friend as well as my mom, and I don't know a lot of kids who can say that. I still remember the smell of lavender in her hair, and the way her eyes flickered and the way she hugged me tight before saying goodbye.
Never forget how special you are, Theo. The fact you are here is nothing short of a miracle, and that is worth celebrating. I love you.
She kissed me on the forehead and promised us pizza when she got home to make up for it. I remember the babysitter waving her off as I got the house ready for my friends so we could play Nintendo and stay up late. But something in the pit of my stomach was uneasy, like I'd missed the step up on the stairs. When Mom didn't come home the following day, that feeling blossomed, sprouted wings, and flew into my heart, where it started breaking away at the fragile casing until it would shatter spectacularly. There was no funeral. The police seemed disinterested in finding her, and my family said very little about it to me, just that she'd gone away and that I'd understand when I was older. I was a day away from turning 18 when my great-uncle Thaddeus told me I had to come to the family estate for my birthday, that it was time. I remember being pissed because I had a date with my high school crush, but that was of little interest to him, and saying no wasn't a wise idea, so I gave in. We drove in relative silence for the majority of the journey. He kept his steely-eyed gaze on the road and furrowed his brow. The man was in his 70s, but still commanded a room with his gait. I tried to block out the feelings of teenage frustration and focus on the country road.
We miss Christina too, you know.
He grumbled from behind a thick white mustache.
Your mother was a wonderful woman. Beautiful soul, and a vision of the world like nothing I'd seen before. But with her and her Aunt Cecilia now gone, well, it's a good thing you're turning 18.
He drummed his fingers against the wheel. I said nothing, and instead chose to let my feelings swirl around inside of me as we pulled up to the Lee estate. A secluded manor house in the countryside, it sat here for nearly 3 centuries with upkeep repairs in various areas, but largely remained the same grandiose spectacle of architecture it had been when first constructed. All members of the Lee family were born here, myself included. It was a rite of passage in a way. As we headed inside, the remnants of the party from Friday night still scattered around, a very somber atmosphere greeted me in the parlor room. Spread out amongst beanbag chairs, leather couches, armchairs, and ottomans were the entire adult Lee clan members. Among them were my great-aunt Agnes, Uncle George, Aunt Eliza, cousins Mick and Ralph, and sat in a large chair at the back was my grandpa, Sir Walter Quincy Carter Lee, a distinguished man with a usually jovial spirit, but now sat morose and deflated, as if carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. His eyes never left mine as I awkwardly shuffled into the room. In fact, none of theirs did. 30 pairs of eyes fixated on me as I sat opposite Walter and gave him a half-hearted smile.
Theodore, I'm sure you're wondering why you're here. And since you're a man now, I will not sugarcoat it.
Walter's voice broke the silence, and much like his facial expressions, it was dripping in weariness.
The Lee family has been blessed with fortune, fame, and success in all things. We have had this for a very, very long time. But it comes at a cost. We have a contract of sorts that must be fulfilled on August 30th, every year, without fail.
He slid across an old, dried-up piece of parchment with a slew of signatures and requirements. I scanned it and felt all the moisture leave my mouth.
On this day in 1756, I, Theodore James Wellington Lee, Patriarch of the Lee family, do hereby commit our earthly bodies and eternal souls to undertake this practice until we are either no more or our obligation is deemed fulfilled. Starting in the waning days of August, we shall congregate on these grounds and be merry, cavort, and enjoy our lives as one is wont to do. But as the clock strikes midnight and hails on the 30th day of the month, we shall undertake the waiting ritual and obey these basic tenements as set out and agreed upon by both parties. Number 1, all members of the Lee family over the age of 18 must be present. Number 2, all members of the Lee family must keep at least one other member in sight at all times. Number 3, if there is a designated focus of the Lee family, they are to be stared at constantly. Number 4, should any members of the Lee family hear voices that distract them, they are to ignore them. Number 5, lights must be available at all times, including backup matches, should there be an issue. And number 6, line of sight must not be broken until the clock once again chimes 12 times to usher in August 31st. I do sign my name in blood to signify the commitment to this pact, and the promise that the current and future generations of the Lee family shall continue this practice, lest we invoke the consequences of non-completion. Signed, Theodore James Wellington Lee. Witness, Elnora Micah Lee. Spouse.
In place of the alternate signature was a bizarre series of characters that I had never seen before. I'd half expected the devil himself to have put his name down, but this just made me feel uncomfortable. What the hell is this? An elaborate birthday prank? I tried to force a laugh, but my body wouldn't cooperate. Grandpa Walters shook his head.
No, lad. It's a commitment to the agreement. Your mother was our original focus person, and now that you're of age, it's you. All you must do is sit in the chair and wait it out for 24 hours. We will all be here with you. When the time is up, you can go. Your successes will come to you naturally and life will be plentiful.
He gestured to the room around him.
All of us have had great lives, and our children, your cousins, will continue this trend. Provided we do our part, here and now.
What choice did I have? I agreed, and Grandpa presented me with a different document that every member of the family had signed in blood on their 18th birthday. I did the same and was free to talk to everyone before the clock chimed midnight. Once it had, we all took our seats and the ritual began. I won't lie, it was initially still feeling like a prank that I was waiting on for the rug to be pulled out from under me, but as the first hour passed and the conversation grew sparse, I realized how seriously everyone was taking this. Imagine being sat in a chair at the back of a grand parlor, books strewn across you from side to side, the well-lit room full of your family members. Some you get on well with, others you avoid like the plague, and every single one of them is staring at you incessantly for 24 hours. About halfway through, still during the day, things would become less tense. Something about the daylight brought with it a comfort of visibility that could not be taken away, and conversations grew lively again. By the time we reached 10:30 p.m., however, tensions were high. Darkness had enveloped the room, and one of my aunts explained that this is when things can go wrong, but stopped herself from continuing any further, hands shaking. I would hear faint whispers from outside in the hall that I brushed off as the maid or a younger family member conversing, but could never totally remove from my mind. The lights would flicker and everyone seemed to be on edge. But we made it to midnight, and on that final chime, the group erupted into cheers and congratulations to one another, myself included. It felt like we'd just come up for air for the first time in decades. Life tasted fresh, and all we wanted to do was experience it. A small but short party was had as thanks, but we were all admittedly so tired that it didn't get too far. I would bow out before 3 a.m. and sleep through the rest of the 31st, going about my life as normal as possible from that day on. Grandpa was right. My life found great success with each passing year. I would be accepted to the art school I had as my top pick. I became a recognized artist, and people all over the world knew of my work. A family of my own had eluded me, but I was a happy 29-year-old for all things considered, even if my partner resented my birthday ritual. I hadn't explained it to her yet, and didn't have plans to do so for as long as possible. Outsiders never fully understood, and it wasn't permitted to have anyone not married involved. I liked Harriet a lot, but I was not ready to go down that route anytime soon. She gave me a defeated goodbye as I left. This was the second birthday of mine she'd gotten to be a part of, and it was clearly bothering her that she couldn't indulge me in the way she wanted. I told her we'd have all the time afterwards, but this did little to assuage her frustrations.
You always keep secrets, Theo. I don't like it.
She huffed, understandably frustrated at not being let in.
How can we progress with our relationship if you keep me at arm's length? You've not even told me about your mother, and it's been nearly 2 years.
I wish I knew myself, but that's just how it is, I shrugged. This was something that hurt, but I'd had many years to process. And if we ever get married, you'll learn all about what goes on, okay? The simple prospect of even mentioning marriage put a smile on her face, and she seemed to forget all about her frustrations. She kissed me and sent me off without a second thought. The Lee estate, by this point, was largely a mix of old and new members. Cousins Mitchell, Eric, Sadie, Pippa, and Kiefer had all long since turned 18 and were now successful 20-somethings. My aunts and uncles from years prior still able to come along. Surprisingly, my grandpa was still the active patriarch. Even at 87, he had plenty of vigor and was relieved to see me pull up, ready to undertake the festivities and party. Now that I'd been doing this for 12 years, it had become a macabre routine that we loved and hated in equal measure. We ate, drank, and talked about life and love. We existed and made sure to cherish those moments. Then, as the clock struck midnight, we took our places and that familiar chill washed over all of us. I don't know what was different. Thinking about it now, something had to have been off. But when you're in a routine for so long, even an odd one like ours can begin to feel mundane. We locked all the doors, entered the parlor, and took our seats, and so it began. The first 30 minutes was of no real issue, some idle chatter here and there, but largely everyone was steeling themselves for the long day ahead. Cousin Mick was using a stress ball, whilst Cousin Ralph had a single earphone in with an audiobook on his phone. A smart decision. At 12:35 a.m., there was a smash against the window. It sounded as if a bird had flown headfirst into the glass, intent on crushing itself. We jumped, but years of experience didn't have us all staring at the window. Instead, Pippa went over within our line of sight and opened the curtains. A cracked window, but no bird. In the distance, we could see something moving, but it wasn't possible to figure out without closer inspection, and that wasn't possible. The family estate is a private land that borders on a large wooded area. We don't govern that part of the land and instead have large fences around the property that shows where our ownership begins. So why would anyone be willingly out there? Shit's weird, right? I chuckled, looking at my grandpa and expecting a nervous laugh back. Instead, he shook in his chair and kept his gaze on me, sweat pouring down his nose and his skin growing sallow.
It's just like last time, with Christina.
He breathed.
We tried to cheat the system and we're still paying for it.
Cheat the system? What the hell was he talking about? I scanned the room, and the older members of the family looked increasingly agitated and anxious. My Aunt Gertrude bordering on hysterical as she whimpered something to my Uncle Bill, pointing a shaking finger at me. He would calm her down, and we'd spend the next 2 hours in almost total silence. But when the lights began to flicker and the anxiety rose again, I felt myself needing to ask, "What's going on, Grandpa?" I breathed, the tension spreading through the group like a disease. He shifted uncomfortably, and my concern only grew. "If you don't tell me right now, I'll walk out of this building, and that'll be the end of the tradition." He immediately leapt out of his seat, eyes wide and wild.
No, absolutely not. We do not need any more suffering and death in this family.
The room grew cold, and my blood along with it. Death? Mom died? The sheer pain of those words leaving my body, like the very air was being pulled from my lungs by force. He sat back into his chair, defeated.
This deal we made, it granted us everything we could want. But there is no deal in this world without a price. That price was for one of us to fail the contract's requirements each year.
There was a tension in the air, permeating through every member of the family as he spoke.
The contract never originally stipulated that we must all gather together. In fact, it actively persuaded us to elect someone to miss the proceedings, to perhaps never inform them of the deal. The trick set out was to do it on a day that would keep at least one of us apart from the rest. We would have obstacles from life or employment that would ensure at least one of us would be unable to make it each year, thus fulfilling their end of the bargain. I don't remember who came up with the idea, but your grandmother, my wife, was in heavy labor when your mother was due, and the family wanted to be there. It just seemed like we'd been thrown a line. No more death. So we decided to make it a mandatory rite of passage for the family. By some stroke of luck, your mother was born just after the stroke of midnight on the 30th, and you in the early evening on the 30th some 25 years later. For over half a century, we were able to maintain peace and tranquility.
His lip quivered and the lights flickered again.
But all debts must be repaid, especially with them.
In a brief moment, for a fraction of a second, I saw something stand in the middle of our parlor. It towered over all of us, hunched over with its bulbous head against the ceiling, red eyes fixated on me. If there was a mouth, I couldn't see it. It held up a twisted digit to its face as if to shush me before the lights flickered back on. If Grandpa or anyone else saw it, they didn't acknowledge it. I tried my best to hold my nerve and ask a question to keep my focus. "What are they?" I managed to muster, hoping there'd be some kind of explanation for what I saw. Maybe an old legend I could connect to them to make sense of all of this. But Grandpa just looked at me, a single tear running down his face as the proud patriarch of our family showed true fear for the first time in my life.
I don't know. Nobody does. They appeared to our ancestor, your namesake, so long ago. He said at the time they were a specter from beneath the earth. His wife insisted they came from the stars. His son was adamant they were an old Celtic legend forgotten to time. But nobody has ever truly known. But we do know one thing, Theo. When we break eye contact, when we don't fulfill our part of the bargain, bad things happen.
I heard more whispering outside, the sound of walls being knocked upon, and something unseen and gargantuan thundering around the home. It was trying to get our attention. Is that what happened to Mom? Did someone in this room fail to fulfill their part of the bargain? I felt hot rage and grief push their way up, compounded by that feeling of being upset on my birthday of all days. I looked around and my eyes settled on Aunt Gertrude, the most nervous of the bunch. She was my last aunt and Christina's eldest sister. "What did you do, Auntie?" She pursed her lips, and I could see the veins in her temple throbbing, trying desperately to hold her composure. But the noises were unrelenting, and nobody in the room was attempting to calm her, as if they knew this needed to happen.
I always resented your mother, Theodore. She was pretty, confident, young, and full of energy. Always got the recognition from Father, the love she wanted and the life she sought. I was never satisfied with what I had, and I thought if she was gone, maybe that good fortune would shine on me. So I took some sleeping pills and passed out.
The staring felt malicious, angry, full of spite, and a hint of regret.
I don't have any ill will towards you, Theodore. But if it meant I could live the life I have now, I'd do it again. Bitch!
Pippa and Sadie piped up from the sides. Both of them loved their Aunt Christina.
All you knew, huh? Never told him? Were you even planning to?
Kiefer spat on the floor in disgust.
His family should fucking burn.
I felt my head swell, a cocktail of emotions coupled with the unseen attempts to distract us. Grandpa took my shoulders in both hands and looked at me, the saddest smile I'd ever seen on a person's face.
I let the smartest and most talented of my girls go because of tradition. Rest assured, I won't do it to you. We've seen enough death and enough loss in this family. Before your mother's birth, we would see 24 of our family taken in as many years. She stabilized us. You continued that. But keeping this from you was the wrong decision, especially at your age.
He let go, backing up to the parlor door.
So if you want to leave, to confront whatever takes us, to get your revenge on us, well, we won't stop you.
The family murmured but didn't protest. Gertrude sobbed silently. How do I know it won't take me? My legs shook as I stood up. It was barely 3 a.m. by this point. We had so long to go.
You don't. But that is part of you making the choice instead of us. Perhaps if you are the one to leave, it'll punish us instead.
I stood there for a few minutes, deciding over my choices. How to respond to a family steeped in secrecy that would willingly send my mother and I to slaughter in order to keep proliferating. It turned out I wouldn't need to wait very long for a decision. The front door hadn't been properly locked, and Harriet came inside, blasting music and armed with a mobile strobe lighting machine. I'd told her that while we had a ritual, I'd focused instead on the partying aspect. She'd followed me here. The second she entered the house, pumping music and the lights shining through the room, they hit several of my family members in the face, breaking eye contact. And just like that, the pact was broken. I don't know if I can fully articulate what happened, but I felt a deep rumble beneath my feet. The air grew thick, and it felt as if time had slowed down. Something was stirring, and as I looked around at the family, I could see on their faces they knew it was coming for them. I looked at Grandpa, still smiling and nodding as the lights went out. I made a direct beeline out of the room with Harriet in hand, slamming the parlor door behind me and pushing my body weight against it.
What the fuck is going on, Theo?
She screamed, confused and distressed. "You just killed us, all because you couldn't wait. You... I tried to find the words, to find the rage, but I was beyond that. I held her close, and we kept our heads down, hoping to make it through whatever hell was behind just a few inches of wood. I saw nothing, but I heard everything. A cacophony of shrill voices screaming, laughing, singing, and groaning in one torrent of suffering. Things were thrown around the room, possibly furniture, possibly a body. I sat against that door until daybreak this morning, when Cousin Pippa gently knocked against the door and told us to come in, that it didn't matter this year anymore. Opening the door, I saw carnage. The room was singed black from wall to wall. Most of the family were laying face down or cowering in the corner, completely unresponsive. As I scanned the room, wordless, full of anxiety and trepidation, I already knew who would be missing. Grandpa. No trace of him existed, as if he'd been wiped from existence. But, to my surprise, Gertrude had been taken too, a smear of blood next to her husband that ran across the length of the wall and ended in the corner. Her husband simply rocked back and forth, holding her green shawl. My attention was then drawn into the center of the room, to something I took with me to the car, something I have in front of me. Now that the full 24 hours have passed, and I have 364 days to decide on what to do next. The family went home, all of us fully understanding what had transpired. Harriet tried in vain to apologize to them, but each one treated her as if she was a ghost. After all, she wasn't part of the family, she wasn't part of the ritual, a part of the game. For all that I'd learned, I still didn't know what they were or where Mom and Grandpa had gone. I dropped Harriet off at home and made her swear to never talk about it. She was devastated, but understood. When she asked me what I intended to do, I simply shook my head. The contract had been amended, you see. Not that there's anything anyone here can do about it aside from listening. To know these things happen. The waiting ritual had been extended to 48 hours. All must attend. Graver consequences for those who don't. A simple note written in obsidian ink had been pinned to the top. Gertrude's signature crossed out and Harriet's name written in her place. A trade, a new debt, 2 more next year. Months later, I can remember all of them, down to the slightest idiosyncrasies and quirks. They were my friends, and they're gone now. There's a hole in my life where they were. Sometimes I'll remember something they said or did, and it'll hit me like a ton of bricks. They're gone now, and I'm only left with memories of them. I'm sorry for being maudlin and bringing everyone down, but I think this is the only way I can really introduce my story and explain why I feel like I have to record this. I think that saying this out loud is the only way I can learn to accept that. I'll try to keep these downward tendencies to myself as I'm recording all of this, but I can't make any promises. I know that being the third wheel in a group can be a terrible thing, but I can think of something worse, being the fifth wheel. If you're the third wheel, that makes your group a semi-functional tricycle. If you're the fifth wheel, you're left as some obscure car from the 50s that no one remembers or cares about. Imagine not being able to follow the in-jokes and shared history of one couple and multiply that by 2. Getting stuck as the fifth wheel is twice as bad. That was the frame of mind I had as we all piled into Ian's car to go to Gila National Forest for our hike. I know that's a weird way to start all of this after my depressing opening, but I want you all to have an idea of my mindset. I'm not quite sure I know how to describe all this, but I know that I need to tell someone. I need someone else to know what happened and help me come to terms with it all. I think the only way I'll be able to explain this would be to help you see from my perspective as much as possible. So there we were, driving down to Gila for a hike, with me feeling like a fifth wheel wedged between 2 of Ian's friends who I didn't know. 3 of us were cramped in the back seat while Ian and his girlfriend were up front. I look back at that unnecessary bit of moping back in August 2016 as one of the last few moments of normalcy I would have in my life. I tried to make the best of the situation, I really did. Ian was always the more social of us. Our mom used to tell us that Ian could make anyone his friend, and that once I had a friend, I kept them. It was one of those parental platitudes that was given to reassure a socially awkward child that there was nothing wrong. Unfortunately, it would take me almost 19 years to learn that that wasn't true. Instead of taking my therapist's diagnosis of social anxiety disorder following a breakup after an office get-together as a means for seeking treatment, I used it as an excuse to cloister myself off from the world. I stayed in my apartment when I wasn't working and told myself that I was just doing what was best for me. Of course, Ian decided that that wasn't healthy and convinced me to go on a weekend-long hike with him. It wasn't until I showed up at his house at 6 in the morning on Friday, after taking the day off of work, that I saw that he had invited others along. I know he saw it as a means of getting me help and breaking me out of my shell. Unfortunately, though, with Ian's extroverted nature, he didn't realize that I liked being in my shell. It was comfortable. A turtle doesn't like being broken out of its shell. After a brief introduction, where I caught no one's name except for those I already knew, my brother and his girl Jessica, due to morning grogginess and the rushed introduction, we packed up the car and left for our hike. It took 3 hours of mostly awkward silence for us to reach our destination. Ian tried to make conversation, but my short responses and the other's sleepiness killed them off fairly quickly. We found the parking lot near the Gila cliff dwellings. As we unpacked our gear, we took a moment to bask in the beautiful sight that sat perched above us. It's hard to believe that someone could carve an entire town into the face of a cliff, but 700 years ago, people managed to do just that. Given that the parking lot was empty, except for us, we would find out why later, and I was in need of some social lubrication, we split a 6-pack of beer and took in the majesty. Here's a picture in case you were wondering what the area looked like. As we finished our beers, got everything prepared, and used the restrooms, Ian explained what path we would be taking in detail. What we didn't know, and what my brother had failed to tell us, was that the West Fork Trail had been closed all that summer due to flooding. To be honest, the path wasn't that dangerous. They had just opted not to clear it due to the recent floodings, so it would be a bit more of a rugged hike. While it wasn't perilous in itself, it did keep us from encountering other hikers, which would cause us a lot of problems if we actually needed help. Ian figured we could make about 2 or 3 miles per hour, and we would be able to complete the Gila Loop, which was about 30 miles long, with enough time to get back on Sunday and be ready for our respective jobs on Monday, with no one any the wiser that we had backpacked a closed section of the national park. As his explanation was a bit heavy on names and locations, some of which I can't recall clearly, I'll opt to include a picture. For the sake of simplicity, this is the path we are planning to take. In addition, I'll include a more detailed map of the area so you can orient yourselves if you want to trace the trail we took. If you plan on following along with the path as I tell you about this experience, all I can say is good luck. Even as I stare at it now, I feel just as lost now as I was then. I was just going along with the group and trying to keep a positive mind about everything. I wanted to try and do a better job of getting to know Ian and Jessica's friends. I think my circumstances had finally begun to set in. I had been living in a quiet apartment in New Mexico for over a year and had no friends. I would go to work and then come home without doing anything else. Sometimes I would spend the entire weekend without saying a single word to anyone or seeing another person. I knew that if I didn't change something quick, that solitude would become the norm, and that frightened me. Our first day was relatively quiet. We spent a majority of the time taking in the sights, soaking in the sun, and breathing the fresh air. The hike felt like we were constantly moving upward. As I was unaccustomed to hiking, I frequently fell behind, but I never completely lost sight of my brother's friends. While we took a break under the shade of a tree, whose bark looked like dried scales from some long-dead alligator, I tried to make small talk with everyone. I fell into a quick conversation with Ian and Jessica about their work and what they had been up to lately. When it came time to talk to the other two, I only managed to get the conversation going for a few sentences before it shriveled up and died. I remembered assuring myself that it would be easier when we stopped for the night. We rested for a while before continuing our ascent up the mesa. This was where everyone realized how truly out of my element I was there. The path up the mesa was agonizing for me. It seemed to never stop climbing up, and there was almost no shade to keep the sun from beating down on us. I was sweating buckets, panting and wheezing whenever they stopped to wait for me to catch up. I tried to pretend that I didn't notice their exasperated whispers or side glances, but it was easier said than done. They seemed like the outdoorsy type that had been doing this sort of thing for years. By the time our path started to level out, I was ready to turn around and leave. It wasn't until we reached the top and looked over everything that I realized how foolish of an idea that was. Even if I was able to convince Ian to give me the keys and let me walk back to the car and go home, I had no idea where I was going or what trail markers we had been using. I imagined splitting off from the group and tromping through poison ivy, bumping into a rapey gang of banjo-playing hillfolk, or getting lost in the dark and wandering in circles until exhaustion and exposure took me. Even if I did manage to hike back to the parking lot, where was I going to go? Would I go back home to my empty apartment, eat a Hot Pocket, and feel sorry for myself again? I decided to tough it out and continue hiking. We made camp at a dry section of the Indian Creek after having hiked a decent amount. Ian was confident that we would make it back on Sunday, and that the next few days were going to be less intensive. We ate some food and stowed the rest in a bear bag a ways away from the camp. We were passing a bottle of whiskey around in front of a campfire we had built when the conversation shifted to the most awkward moments everyone had experienced. Ian retold his story about the first time he met Jessica at a club, where he was way too drunk for his own good and ended up puking into her purse. Jessica bristled at the memory and jokingly called Ian an asshole for that. Each person shared their stories about a bumbling first kiss where their braces got hooked together, locking themselves out of their dorm rooms in their underwear, their cringe-inducing high school edgelord personality, and caring for their drunken boyfriend who puked into their favorite bag. Then the bottle came to me, and it was my turn to tell a story. I instantly knew what my most embarrassing story was the moment we started the conversation. I didn't tell them about the door, though. Instead, I made up a story about me ripping my pants in front of a group of people during a work interview that I had probably ripped straight from a 90s sitcom. They laughed with me, and I felt like a piece of shit. They had bothered to reveal their most embarrassing moments and were commiserating in their shared experience, and here I was too afraid to tell them the truth, to tell them about the door. The conversation continued for a bit afterwards as we killed the bottle. When it was dead, we all went to bed, still pretty drunk after dousing the campfire. I woke up in the middle of the night, desperately needing to use the bathroom. Still a bit fuzzy from the whiskey, I tromped out into the woods to do my business, but it wasn't until I was almost done that Nadia's voice cut through the blackness. She asked me if I had a lighter. Since I hadn't heard her approach, the sound of her voice made me jump. It would have scared the piss out of me had I not just gone to the bathroom. I mumbled something about having a lighter back around the camp. She told me that she had dropped hers and asked me to help her look for it, but I was too out of it to be any good to anyone, so I told her we'd look for it later. I vaguely remember her mumbling a protest as I stumbled back to my sleeping bag. It wasn't until I woke up the next morning that I realized how stupid I had been. Apparently, they had heard yowling in the surrounding woods all last night. They thought the sound could have possibly been the Mexican gray wolf, but no one was sure. Ian knew that they inhabited the area, but were very uncommon. I paled at the thought of being mauled by a wolf while out peeing in the middle of the woods. I decided next time I would wake up Ian before going out in the woods to answer the call of nature. We packed up a while later, after a light breakfast, and continued our hike. The second day was a little better. The overbearing sun I had suffered under previously was hidden behind heavy clouds. We crossed a number of rivers as we followed the 157-729 junction. We went along Little Bear Canyon as we headed towards the TJ Corral, which was towards the end of the hiking loop. As the path hadn't been cleared yet, we frequently had to dodge patches of poison ivy and stinging nettles. I fared much better on this hike, and despite nursing a slight hangover, I felt like I was doing a much better job of getting around with my pack and clunky boots my brother had loaned me. We made camp around midday and purified some water from a nearby river, boiling and adding Lodine tablets to it. As the last section of our hike didn't really have many opportunities for drinkable water. I think that maybe our encounter last night with the yipping and yowling wolves had added a bit of seriousness to the hike, as there wasn't as much joking around or conversation this night. We talked a little bit, but mainly just had something to eat while we stared into the campfire. Ian and Jessica were the first to call it for the night. I stayed up with the others for a bit, but we were mainly silent. The other two slowly went off after a bit, and I decided to enjoy the warmth a bit longer before getting ready to go to bed for the night. Just as I had finished dousing the fire, I remember Gary coming up to me and asking me for the map. He told me he wanted to plan out the rest of our trip, and that there was a spring nearby that we should really visit and that wasn't too far out of the way. I grabbed the map from Ian's pack and gave it to him before turning in. I woke up the next morning to the sound of Ian rustling around his bag. He sounded angrier the longer he searched. He knocked mess kits into each other as he peered deep into the pack for something he was missing. Frustrated that he wasn't finding the item he was looking for, he turned the bag upside down and dumped out everything. He was practically ready to tear out his own hair, and it seemed like he had spent the entire morning looking for that one thing. Wanting to know what it was, I walked up to him and we started talking.
Hey man, you see the map anywhere? I can't seem to find it.
Where's Gary? I gave him the map last night so we could map out a little detour on the trip so we could visit a spring. Why don't you ask him? He probably knows. It was then that Ian said something that changed everything.
Jerry? Who are you talking about? Do you mean Oliver? Don't tell me you thought his name was...
No. I'm talking about Gary. Tall guy, kinda lanky.
You're joking, right?
He looked confused for a few seconds and made a questioning sound like a really old computer trying to process something moments before it catches on fire. The pieces clicked and Ian shouted,
Some fucking guy asked you for our map in the middle of the night and you just fucking gave it to him? You handed our stuff to some random stranger you met in the woods?
I tried to explain myself and tell him that I knew Gary, and that he did too since I remember hiking with him the day before. But I couldn't find the words to convey that point. It was here that Jessica stepped in and asked what was going on. Ian vented vitriol.
How fucking stupid are you, Evan? Jesus Christ! We needed that map to get around smoothly since the trails out here haven't been cleared!
Ian shouted for about 15 minutes while everyone became aware of our situation. Jessica managed to calm him down enough so we could figure out our next move. While we weren't completely screwed, as Ian had memorized a large portion of the trail markers, it was going to be a lot harder to navigate the necessary junctions to bring us back around to the car. We packed up all our stuff, making sure that the guy hadn't taken anything else, and we left. The entire hike I could feel Ian's eyes drilling into me. The last time I had seen him this furious was just before he got into a fight with Aaron Fredlinger and beat him to a pulp. He got suspended for a week, and Aaron got a black eye, busted lip, and never said anything about our mother again. Each time we came across a break in the path, we spent a few minutes while Ian tried to remember where to go. The fact that the trails had been closed and the paths were overgrown only served to make everything more difficult. I think that's how we made a wrong turn and began wandering on the faint trail. I don't know if that's actually where it went wrong, since we didn't have the map at the time, but that's my best guess. Towards midday, tensions had reached a critical point. Ian frequently mumbled things that would make a sailor blush, while Jessica tried to hide the fact that she was close to crying. Oliver attempted to lighten the situation by telling everyone that we just had to follow the compass and we would get home safe and sound. Oliver's girlfriend didn't say much. She just stared quietly at her feet as we walked. I think she had the right idea, since Lucas was constantly misplacing his footing and slipping. He looked like he had downed a fifth of vodka and was now trying to walk home on a tightrope while being randomly shocked with a cattle prod. The realization twisted something deep down inside me and made me want to throw up. I stopped walking and began talking to Lucas. "What's going on with you, man?" Ian, still pissed at me, took the opportunity to vent a bit.
Huh? What are you talking about now?
"Lucas is bumbling and twitching all over the place. What's wrong with him?"
Don't be a dick, man. You know he has multiple sclerosis. We told you before the hike started about his condition.
As soon as he said it, the events came rushing back to me as clear as day. I recalled Ian pulling me to the side and telling me about his friend's diagnosis and how this was likely going to be his last opportunity to undertake a long hike like this, so we had to help him and move slowly. I remembered watching him scramble up the trail and thinking about our own mom and her illness. It brought back bittersweet memories of birthday wishes given to us from hospital beds and hearing her sob quietly to herself in the middle of the night when she thought we were asleep. Guilt flooded over me, and I stepped forward to apologize to Lucas when it happened. Lucas growled at me the instant I took a step forward, and he dropped to a hunched position on his hands and feet. It almost looked like his skin was bristling at a possible threat, and I could see his broken and decayed teeth as he hissed at all of us before taking off at a hopping stride into the woods. He moved like one of those CGI monstrosities from the last Planet of the Apes movies. His shaky and unstable balance was replaced by a more natural and animalistic gait as he took off into the distance and disappeared among the trees. The last thing I saw was what I assumed were his clothes sloughing off his body, revealing that they weren't actually clothes, but gray folds of skin. Oliver was the first to talk.
What the fuck?
As soon as Oliver said those words, it was like a switch had flipped that set everyone to panic mode. We began to run along the trail as if it would do us any good. The only thought in my head was to put as much distance as possible between us and that thing. I think it took a good 15 minutes for us to run out of energy with our heavy packs and the disorienting nature of the woods. As we tried to catch our breath, I surveyed the area around us and came to a horrible realization. In our panic, we had run off the path and were now even deeper in the woods. We tried to make sense of what we saw. I just remembered Ian mumbling the same phrase over and over.
What the hell is that?
The short answer was it was Lucas. The long of it is this. There was no Lucas. Not really. I know how confusing this all seems with Gary and Lucas. The truth is, I did that because I don't think I could have appropriately explained it to you without you first experiencing it from my eyes. I don't know what to call those things, but they do something to your mind. They insinuate themselves into your memories. They wrap themselves up in a wall of your recollections, and even though you know something is wrong, you can't quite put your finger on it. Your group of 4 friends could grow to 5 and you wouldn't be any the wiser. You look at it and you recognize the face. You remember events. You remember getting drunk at the bar together. You remember them crying on your shoulder after a rough breakup. You remember everything that happened between you, but none of it's true. I don't know how it does it. It crawls its way into your head somehow and makes you see things in a way that benefits them. It can mold memories, but it can't mimic human movement. It walks on 4 claws, not 2 feet. It growls and hisses and snarls. It doesn't talk. It infiltrates, observes, and waits. It was hunting us and trying to drive us deeper into the woods. It was succeeding. We never really reached much of a conclusion about what that thing was, but we did reach a consensus that we had to get out of here as soon as possible. I watched Ian as he looked around at the forest and came to the same realization that I did. We were lost. He didn't tell the others. I think he realized that panicking would only get us in more trouble. Instead, he told us to follow him. With the shock of our encounter setting in, we could do nothing but follow his lead and hope it all worked out. As we walked, we could hear the sounds of distant animals yowling and calling out to each other. The terror of our situation deepened as the others whispered that those were the same noises that they had heard the first night in the woods. Whatever this thing was, it was following us and calling out to other things in the area. At the time, I couldn't stop thinking about one of them barreling out of the underbrush and sinking its black and rotting teeth into my neck before the rest of the group could even react. I remember brushing the thought off and mentally reassuring myself that there were 6 of us here, and we had only actually encountered one of those creatures. As the day pressed on, and we seemingly wandered south in an attempt to pick up another trail that would lead us back to the parking lot, I couldn't help but shake a nagging feeling in the back of my mind. It felt like I had forgotten some important deadline that I should have never forgotten about. It wasn't until Oliver mentioned his wish of being back in the car that Jessica stopped dead in her tracks. We all turned towards her, but knew what was coming the second she asked.
We only took one car down, right?
Ian snapped, more fearful than frustrated.
Of course we did. Remember how cramped everyone was in that tiny-ass Prius with all our camping gear smashed in the trunk and on our laps? What about it?
Jessica went white, as if this were the first time that Ian had ever raised his voice to her. She paused for a moment before asking,
How many of us are here right now, and how many does your car seat?
Ian's car sat 4 people comfortably, 5 uncomfortably, and there were 6 of us out in the woods at that moment. Everything happened at once. Ian swore, Oliver's girlfriend gave a half shriek and a half gasp, while I looked wide-eyed from person to person, trying to figure out which one of us didn't belong there. Sarah was the only one who managed to say something, and that was,
Me, Sarah.
She hadn't finished her words before her jaw popped open. I don't mean that it dropped open like she was astonished or something. It popped open like it had dislocated from her face. The space between her lips was a massive, sickly pink void of inflamed gums that was at least a foot wide. She looked at us with dead and dull eyes as she slowly raised a twitching hand up to her jaw and tried to lock it back into a more human-esque appearance. She popped it back into place with a hollow-sounding squelch of meat and bone shifting, as if nothing was wrong about what had just happened before she tried to speak again.
It's me.
Ian was the first to react. He stepped toward the failed facsimile of a human and swung his walking stick at her face while bellowing for her to get out of here. She hopped back from the attack in a sloppy motion and landed on all fours. Her body shuddered as if an electrical jolt had passed through her as she slowly backed away from us while facing Jessica the entire time. She hissed at us one last time before retreating deeper into the woods with a convulsing lope. It took a moment for us to regain our composure before we continued walking while trying to look in every direction at once. I remember Oliver rambling as we walked. He kept asking, although no one was responding to him.
Did you see how it moved? It was twitching like an epileptic in a rave. You ever see one of those documentaries about mad cow disease? That thing was twitching and moving like those infected cows. What the hell was that thing? Was it a person? What kind of person could do that to their body? They tried to talk to us.
He rambled for hours before we had to stop. We had to tell him to shut up because we were worried about that thing hearing us. Though that wasn't really the case. We made him stop talking because it only served to scare us. Despite stopping for the night, none of us actually slept. We sat around a campfire and listened to the sound of high-pitched whining and yelping coming from all around us. It seemed like any time I actually got close to falling asleep, the calls would start up and jolt me awake. We spoke in hushed whispers and tried to figure out what they wanted with us, even though none of us really wanted the answer to that question. The hours dragged on almost endlessly before dawn broke and we continued our hike. We spent Sunday hiking around and trying to find a similar site. Without any real sense of where we were and where we were going, our only hope was to stumble across another hiker or find an area with a high enough vantage point that we could survey the entire area. Unfortunately, any elevations we climbed didn't afford a good view of the area, and it was extremely unlikely that we would find another hiker, due to the fact that the trail had been closed and wasn't cleared. Even if we did, what were the chances that we would trust them and be certain it wasn't one of those things? Midway through the day, Ian whispered to me,
"Count the people wearing backpacks. One of them is with us again."
I casually looked over my shoulder and noticed that one of our group was walking without any gear. They trailed behind us, but were still in our vicinity. They moved slowly, but didn't show any of the jerking movements of the previous two. The thought that it was learning to mimic our movements unsettled me. Without really thinking, I shucked off my backpack and approached the imposter. Before they knew what was happening, I shoved them as hard as I could. The instant my hand pressed into their shirt, I felt something slick and warm give way, like the outer layer falling off a rotten mango. Their shirt slid off their body into my hands, and I quickly realized it was their skin. The thing was actually naked, but gave the appearance of clothes by altering the color of its almost translucent skin. I dropped the skin that had sloughed off, and it hit the ground with a wet slap. The creature toppled backwards and began yelping. I can only describe the sound it made like this. Imagine getting out of your bed in the middle of the night to go take a piss. As you're feeling your way through the darkness to get out of your room, you step on your dog's tail. Imagine that startled yelp of pain and shock that comes along with it. Now focus on that emotion you felt when you heard that noise, that sudden surprise and guilt. In reality, the sound it made was nothing like a hurt dog. It just reminded me so much of a wounded pet that I can't differentiate the sounds. Here's the worst part. I shouldn't have felt bad. Those things were stalking and tormenting us. They were likely hunting us, and I felt bad for harming it. I shouldn't have felt bad about it, but it wanted me to, so I did. The thing writhed on the ground on its back for a few seconds, making a pitiful noise. It reached back with its arms and pushed itself upright on its hands and the balls of its feet. Its joints popped wetly and its muscles and bones adjusted to fit its new position. It crab-crawled away while shrieking the entire time as Ian pursued it with his walking stick, hoping to catch up to it and cave its head in. It wasn't until the thing disappeared from sight that I realized the shrieking wasn't just coming from the monster, but from Jessica as well. It was trying to mimic her response. With Ian gone and Jessica's screams possibly drawing more of those things to us, I decided I had to do something. I stepped forward and wrapped her up in my arms. She was shaking like a leaf in the wind. I stroked her hair and whispered that it was over. She managed to choke out something about its face. All I could make out was that something was terribly wrong with its face. She calmed down as I told her that everything was going to be all right. I didn't believe that myself, but it was the only thing I could think of that might bring her comfort. Ian returned fuming that the monster escaped, and I awkwardly broke off the hug. Ian didn't say anything, he just started walking. We continued following him, hoping that he would find the way, but knowing that he probably wouldn't. 6 hours later, we settled down for the night. It felt like we had been going in circles all day and made absolutely no progress. For all we knew, that thing could have been tinkering around with our memories and convincing us that familiar landmarks were new and leading us deeper into the woods. I didn't tell the others, but I think I knew what those things wanted with us. They wanted to lead us deeper into the woods, where they were trying to force us to exhaustion, and when we were too weak to defend ourselves, they would descend upon us and eat us. Oliver was right about that. If that thing is similar to us in any way, then those twitching spasms were likely some sort of prion disorder that came from eating humans. After eating some jerky, since we decided against a fire and drawing more of them to us, we reached the conclusion that we would have to sleep in shifts. I volunteered for the first watch because my insight into the monster's behavior had robbed me of any desire to sleep. The others went off without so much as another word. They were exhausted, and it wasn't until an hour into my watch that I realized I was too. Even given the monster's grotesque appearance, everyone needs to sleep. Jessica joined me about 2 hours into my watch. She admitted that she couldn't sleep after our encounter with the creature. I nodded in agreement. Both of us had seen something terrible that the others hadn't. We talked for a good 30 minutes about what we thought was going on and how everyone was handling it. She was worried about Ian. She confessed that he was acting erratic and that he was scaring her. I wrapped my arm around her for a moment and told her that we were all scared. She looked into my eyes and told me that she was glad I was here, and I felt something twist deep down inside me that I had buried a long time ago when I first met her. The longer she stayed with me on watch, the more personal our conversation became. She confessed that she and Ian had been fighting a lot recently, and that she was wondering if they were going to work it all out. At the start of their relationship, they were great together. He made her feel wonderful, but there was something that didn't feel right, like there was something missing. I listened to her talk about everything that was going on in her life, and I knew I had to do something. I knew that if I didn't do it now, I would regret it. I had to tell her about the door. She listened quietly as I told her everything. It was the event that precipitated my breakdown at work and my social anxiety disorder diagnosis at the therapist's office. Everything started off simply enough one Friday at work. I was in the lunchroom eating my sandwich and reading a book, as per usual, while my coworkers talked about their plans for the weekend. One of them was having a housewarming party, and they were inviting everyone at work. I figured the invitation was only extended to people he was talking to until he asked me if I would be able to make it on Saturday. As it was the first time I had been invited to hang out after work, I chose to go. I spent all Saturday getting ready, planning what interesting topics to bring up in case there was a lull in conversation, and the bottle of wine I was planning to give him as a housewarming gift. After psyching myself up, I left to go to the party with the bottle in hand and my spirits high. I convinced myself that I was going to be the life of the party, and that maybe if I played my cards right, I could finally find a friend at work that would make the time fly by instead of dragging on. It wasn't until I reached the house that the false bravado began to crumble apart. I stopped in front of the neighbor's house, as everywhere else already had a car parked there. It was then that I felt my heart beating like I had just run a mile. I began heading up the driveway with the wine bottle slick in my hands from my palms sweating. It wasn't until I reached the front door that I realized that something was terribly wrong. All that excitement that had been building up since Friday afternoon was now replaced with something else. Apprehension. All those topics I had thought up seemed boring, and all the reassurances I had given myself seemed hollow. I didn't feel prepared for this at all. At this point, a small part of me whispered something that has stuck with me to this very day. That voice intimated that they never really wanted me to come. They had only given me that invitation as a courtesy and didn't actually expect me to come out to their house. It said that if I knocked on that door, that I would be making a fool out of myself. It told me that I wasn't even comfortable in my own skin, so how could I even dare to imagine that they would enjoy my company? They wanted to celebrate with their friends. They didn't want to listen to me fumble for something to talk about. All those fears flashed in front of me, taunting me, demanding that I knock on the door and make myself look like an idiot. That part of me told me that I was better off alone, and I listened. I turned around without even knocking on the door, and I left. No one had come in, and the music was playing loudly, so I doubt they would have heard me anyways. I shouldn't have been there in the first place. Maybe I saw them watching me from the window, maybe I didn't. Maybe they were laughing at me as I drove away, flustered and embarrassed. Maybe they went back to the party and joked about the social outcast who had seemingly freaked out and ran away from their house while I went home and cried in the shower. Maybe. Jessica listened as I told her the story. She smiled sadly as I started to cry into her shoulder. All those feelings I had experienced outside of my coworker's house came rushing back. All that fear, foolishness, and the fatalistic failure smashed into me like waves on a shore. She whispered soothing words into my ear and waited for me to collect myself. Once I did, she pulled away and told me that it wasn't my fault. It was there, under the moonlight, with her face inches away from mine, that I did the worst thing I've ever done in my life. I kissed her. It was slow, hesitant, romantic. I looked into her eyes and I saw her beautiful face. She pulled me towards her as she leaned back. Lost in the moment, I held her against me while telling her all the things I should have said when we first met and realized that I loved her. I held her like that for a few moments, afraid that if I let her go, I would lose this perfect moment. She was warm. She smelled like wildflowers. She smelled like happiness. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I felt comfortable and content. I don't know when I drifted off, but I do remember waking up. In the love-drunk excitement of the previous night, I didn't think once about Ian or the consequences of my decision. I only thought about Jessica, and I forgot that she was his girlfriend. What I did last night was a beautiful mistake. I convinced her to cheat on him with me. I needed to tell him before the truth came out. I needed him to understand how I felt. I got up from the ground and stretched. Jessica was gone. I assumed she had gone back to her sleeping bag in the middle of the night. I walked over to Ian, who was just waking up. He rubbed the sleep out of his eyes and asked me if I stayed up all night. The words bled out of me, and once they started, I couldn't stop. I don't know what happened, man. We were just talking one moment, and the next... Oh, Jesus, I didn't mean for it to happen. You know I love you, man. I wouldn't do anything to hurt you. It just happened, and now I can't take it back. Jessica's cry of surprise cut me off before I could go any further. Both me and Ian turned to the sound of her distress, and we knew instantly what had happened. The backpacks with our compass, food, and water had been stolen. It knew. Don't you see it, goddammit? It knew we couldn't identify it without a backpack, and it couldn't shape its skin to the appearance of one, so it stole them away from us. Now, the next time it wormed its way into our group, we wouldn't be any the wiser. Jessica and I never talked that night. Jessica had never left my brother's side that night. They had zipped their sleeping rolls together. She didn't open up to me about her worries, and I never actually kissed her. I poured my heart out to a thing wearing Jessica's skin while it was in my arms. I confessed my truest feelings to an ersatz entity masquerading as a person. I felt sick. The others woke up quickly after hearing Jessica screaming. We quickly searched around the area, hoping to find some scrap of food or some indication of where our stuff had been taken to. We found nothing. It was long gone. We had no food, no water, no hope. We had no way of telling when one of those things was hijacking our heads and pretending to be part of our group so it could distract us. With our compass gone, we had no means of following a set direction and hoping to pick the trail back up. In short, we were screwed. Oliver demanded to know what I was doing last night. He wanted to know how I could be so careless as to fall asleep when I should have been watching over them and our gear. I lied and told him that someone had come around in the middle of the night to relieve me from my shift. I didn't mention that it was one of those things impersonating Jessica. I couldn't bear to look either my brother or his girlfriend in the eyes at that point. Oliver started to yell, but stopped when he saw I was on the verge of tears. I don't know if it was mercy or disgust that caused him to stop. It doesn't matter either way. We gathered up the only thing that they hadn't taken in the night, our sleeping bags, and continued walking. The hike without water or the prospect of food was unbearable. We were already exhausted, and the realization that we were soon going to be starving and dehydrated only served to sap more of our energy. Within a few hours, my mouth felt gummy and dry. While we were still under the canopy of leaves, the temperature was still in the high 80s and low 90s. It didn't take long for dehydration to set in. I kept licking my lips in an attempt to keep them moist, but I could feel them beginning to crack as my saliva began to dry up. As we walked, Oliver picked up his pace and caught up with me. I looked over at him and knew without saying anything that another one of those things had joined our group.
Don't look directly at it. Just keep it at the corner of your eyes. I think that's how it messes with your mind. It would explain why you remember that guy that night, but the rest of us can't. You saw him, but the rest of us didn't. Don't get close. Just keep it in the corner of your eyes. It's been trailing us for about half an hour now. I think it just wants to watch and follow us.
I pretended to be cracking my neck and looked at the tag-along in my peripheral vision. It trailed behind us about a dozen feet. In its resting state, its facial features appeared staticky. I could make out eyes and a nose, but it was constantly shifting and rippling like bubbling plastic. At this point, we were too tired to even bother with chasing it off. We just kept walking and hoping that it wouldn't try to join the group. It seemed content to keep its distance and keep us in its line of sight. It followed us for about 2 miles before it broke off towards the trees with a shambling, awkward gait. We were too tired to even try and set up a shift system. We just huddled together in an attempt to convince ourselves that we were safer when we were closer together. But every time one of us got comfortable enough to drift off, one of those things would start making noise. The noises started off as high-pitched yips, whose sounds seemed to travel for miles. As the night drew on, they grew more aggressive. I remember one time as I was drifting off, hearing the grasping rasp of my name. The things weren't just following us, they were learning. They were perfecting their mimicry. The thought disturbed me more than the idea of them out there watching us in the darkness. How long would it take them to become more human than human? What would they do once they were capable of walking amongst people again? I drifted off to sleep with that thought beating around in my head like a man trapped inside a wall. We got up on Tuesday morning and left without a word. At this point, there was nothing left to say. Some of us had been awake all night without any food or water. The constant stress had completely worn us down. We continued hiking in the same direction we had been going in, with the false hope that we would come across someone. In the end, our hike looked more like a death march. My feet were covered in blisters that had ruptured and plastered the soles of my feet to my socks. Every step I felt like I was tearing open the wounds a bit more. In an attempt to take my mind off the discomfort, I focused on my brother, who was walking in front of me. He wasn't as much walking as he was limping forward. He had stopped using his walking stick and was dragging it behind him like it was a broken leg. I watched as he stepped over a rock and the walking stick slipped out of his hands. He kept dragging himself forward as if nothing had happened. He didn't even register it falling out of his hands. It was at that point that I knew that something was wrong. I knew that my brother wasn't my brother anymore. I quickly picked up his stick as I passed it. Amy went to call out to him and ask if he was all right, but I shushed her. I was so sure that one of those things had replaced him and was now leading us deeper into the woods. I realized that I would only have one chance at this. The instant it knew that we knew, it would try and run away. All it would take was one good swing to the back of the head, and we would be able to take out one of those things. The stick had a bit of weight to it, about 5 or 6 pounds, enough to crack open a skull if swung hard enough. I began walking faster while trying to avoid the underbrush that might give away my approach. The thing wearing my brother's skin continued limping forward as I drew closer. I waited until I was within swinging distance before raising the stick above my head. My heart was beating in my chest and my palms were so sweaty that it felt like the stick would slide right out of my hands. I kept on moving forwards. I whispered, "I'm sorry," just before I swung the walking stick down with all my strength. Ian turned to face me, asking what I was sorry for. My muscles locked and I stopped mid-swing, and the stick stopped just inches away from his face. He blinked in surprise before asking me what was wrong. His voice sounded distant and empty, like he was in between a waking and sleep state. It was then that I knew the extent of his condition. He was pale and looked like the slightest breeze would blow him over. He wasn't one of those things. He was delirious from dehydration, sleep deprivation, and starvation. The walking stick fell out of my hand and bounced on the ground next to us. I dragged my tongue across my lips and felt like I was licking sandpaper. I whimpered, "Jesus, Ian, I thought you were one of those things. I almost... God, I'm so sorry." He didn't react to my apology. He just turned around and continued walking in the direction we were going. Amy just watched everything unfold numbly before she started following me. Oliver shook his head sadly, but he didn't look any better. His eyes were glazed and his lips were cracked and red from rubbing at them. I watched my brother shambling forward, and it reminded me of one of those old voodoo movies where someone is put in a trance and forced to walk until they die from exhaustion. His mouth hung open, and he moved like he was being dragged along on puppet strings. I picked up the walking stick and began to follow them. I wondered how much longer he had left in him, and what any of us could do if he just fell over and stopped walking. I wondered how much longer any of us had. I don't know how long we walked. Everything melted together in a muddled malaise at the time. I remember losing my footing and tripping a few times, but I barely felt it. The third time, I didn't even realize I was lying on the ground until Jessica stepped on me as she was passing by. There was no apology. She was too far gone to recognize what she had stepped on. I dragged myself to my feet and felt lightheaded, but continued putting one foot in front of the other. The 5th time I fell, I wondered if it would have been better just to lay down and wait to die. An excited yap behind me from one of those things drove me to my feet. It wasn't until we bumped into the sign for Little Bear Canyon that I realized how close we were to salvation. The post for Little Bear Canyon also had a branching sign that pointed in the direction for TJ Corral, which was only a few miles from where we started at the Gila Cliff Dwellings if we walked along Route 15. Ian was heading in the right direction, and we were almost home free. In my excitement, I began calling to the others to let them know that the end was near. I looked around me and shouted, "Jessica, Ian, Oliver, Heather, Amy, I know where we need to—" The words died on my lips as I counted the names and realized it wasn't over yet. The others kept moving as if they hadn't heard me talking. The imposters shuffled alongside us, and for once, it was easy to identify them. I don't know whether or not they had let down their guard after seeing our conditions, but this one was obvious. She moved slowly, but her movement didn't convey her exhaustion. Everyone else was sweating and looked like the walking dead, but she was fine. I waited for her to get close enough to follow the trail the others were going down before I raised Ian's walking stick and growled, "Turn around right fucking now! I can see you!" She turned around slowly, and I felt my heart skip a beat. She looked almost exactly like Jessica, except for a brownish tinge to her hair. She could have been her twin. I knew what it was planning before it even opened its mouth and asked,
What are you doing, Evan?
"Don't call me that!"
What are you rambling about? Please move out of the way. We're almost safe from those things.
"I know what you are." Heather turned white at the realization. She began speaking quickly.
I'm not one of those things. Please, Evan, you have to remember. There were 6 of us. Those things want us to think there were only 5 so they can take one of us without the others caring. Those things don't want us all. They only want the weakest one. Please, let's go before they catch.
"Shut up!" I snapped. I raised the walking stick in my hand and brandished it at her.
Think about it, Evan. Do I look like one of those things? Do I speak like them? That should be enough to prove I'm human.
"No, Ian's my brother. Jessica is his girlfriend."
I'm your girlfriend. I sat on your lap on the car ride. Please don't kill me. Evan, I love you. Don't you remember, Evan? I love you.
I lowered the stick that was in my hand as memories bombarded me. I had met her one night when my brother forced me to go to a club with him. Heather had been sitting at the bar all night drinking. It wasn't until she tried to stand up and fell into my arms that we actually talked. I remembered lazy Sundays in bed watching cheesy B sci-fi movies. I remembered holding her close to me after making love and hearing her whisper sweet nothings into my ear. I remembered our life together. I rasped, "Heather, I'm so sorry. I didn't know."
Evan, it's not your fault.
She went to touch me, and I sprang back like I'd been bitten by a snake. The instant I heard those words, I knocked. The stick caught her unaware in the side of her face. I felt her jaw give way under the sudden force of my attack.
I love...
She burbled through broken teeth. The second strike dented her temple as the temporal bone shattered. She kept trying to talk, but it was too late, and too much damage had been done. That door was shut now. I kept swinging the walking stick down on her head until it splintered and snapped. I looked up from her twitching body and saw my brother watching me in horror. I spoke through gritted teeth and regarded him with red-rimmed eyes. "Come on, we have to go." He went to keep talking, but I walked past him. I didn't want to explain it to him. He eventually ran ahead, invigorated with the prospect of finding rescue on the road. I looked behind me one last time. The last thing I saw was one of those things dragging away Heather's corpse. It looked emaciated and half mad with starvation. At that very moment, I wasn't afraid of the thing. I felt pity. Whether or not it forced that emotion on me, I'll never know. I turned away and caught up with the others on Route 15. We were on the road in 15 minutes before we managed to flag down a car and an ambulance was called for us. The doctor said that our exposure to the elements, combined with our starvation and dehydration, triggered the auditory and visual hallucinations we experienced. I was surprised by the condition they said we were in. I could have sworn it had only been a day or two since we'd eaten, but they said we showed signs of severe dehydration and starvation. It's the typical response you'd be given after hearing our half-dead ramblings about creatures warping their flesh and our memories to drive us to the brink of death so they could prey on us when we were at our weakest. We spent a week there while receiving treatments, recounting our horrific experiences and then subsequent psych evaluations before we were released. I tried to talk to the others about it. Ian and Jessica refused to talk to me about it. I don't really know Oliver or Amy, so that's off the table too. They just want to forget. I can't forget. Here's the thing. I still remember Nadia asking me to help her find her lighter. I recall staying up late and talking with her by the campfire while she smoked like a chimney. I can recite Gary's terrible puns that he'd make about almost everything, and Lucas's determination at hiking this trail while slowly succumbing to the effects of his multiple sclerosis. I can recall whispering sweet nothings to Jessica under the glow of the full moon. I can still envision that moment clear as day, even months later. I know the conversation we had word for word. I can remember the feeling of her skin against mine and the smell of her hair as I pressed myself against it when I reached that one true moment of connectivity. I remember Heather pleading for me and begging me not to kill her. Despite recording all this months later, I can see all those things clearly. Sometimes, late at night, I can even remember driving up to Gila National Park with Heather sitting on my lap, playfully grinding against me and telling me how fun our hike was going to be. Sometimes I think about that memory more than I should. Since I can't talk to my brother or Jessica about this, I had to find some other outlet. I guess I'm recording all this for one reason: catharsis. In the end, I kept wondering if what I did was right. Did I make the right choice? I want you to hear this and tell me that I had no other option, that the risk of one of them escaping into the city forced my hand. I know that's not the case. I could have walked away or tried to scare her off, but I didn't. What kind of person can look into someone's eyes, remember all the things they did and the life they had, and do what I did? Who can have all those memories and end everything so callously? It doesn't matter if none of it was real, because in that moment, it was to me. Who can look at someone and feel such love for them before you kill them? The answer to that question is simple now that I ask myself aloud. I just don't like the answer. I heard the cave Mitrione has another name, the Siren's Cave. The folks say there's a gust that flows through the cave and causes the sounds of people calling to you. I heard it ain't just the wind. Some old settlers and explorers got stuck down there. Things got real, and before they knew it, boom, they were gone. Maybe they fell into the pit. My two friends, Trey and Anthony, kept on discussing the majesties of this strange cave in the middle of nowhere outside of our town. Some 70 miles north, there was a large swath of land housing a large cave that held the eponymous Wailing Cave. I was always up for an adventure, being 17 and spending most of my life outdoors, but it was the insistence of my two aforementioned friends and their propensity to do far more daring feats that led us to this particular adventure. Now, I never liked caving much. My claustrophobia made sure of that. The idea of being trapped in the earth with immovable walls all around you. Thankfully, the caves we went into were never that small, but I still always felt nervous when we went. But when you're young and with your friends, it's easy to muster up courage to do what you normally wouldn't. I felt safe with them. Come on, Bryce. You know if we tell our folks, they'll just stop us. Or worse yet, insist on coming with and providing boring rules we don't need. Trey jabbed my shoulder playfully. We're strong, virile men. We don't need any of that shit. Plus, we're not going to need much more than ropes, lights and backpacks, and some basic gear. We'll be in and out with either a boring story to tell or footage that will net us those huge YouTube bucks. Yeah, Trey, I know. I rolled my eyes, imitating his enthusiasm. All right,